purposes and for shipping and commerce. And now the sea levels are starting to rise. That's why we're seeing, because we built right up to the water's edge, and now it's rising. Arctic sea ice is the lowest it's been in 1,000 years. Glacial retreat is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. So we're seeing a major shift in some of these variables that have been fairly steady since we've been on the planet. And uh, what we're seeing is that what we had always thought was sort of a stationary environment is becoming what we call non-stationary. So using the past historical data for flooding information is no longer working for us because that's actually changing. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Next. So there's a direct correlation between air temperature increasing, and this is from, again, NCA 4, and you can see several different temperature plots here. There's a direct correlation to land temperature and sea temperature. The ocean is absorbing a lot of the heat that we're seeing in the atmosphere, and that in itself causes the ocean to expand. Next slide. And so we have all these different factors, one of them being the warming of the ocean, because as the ocean, as I said, warms up, it expands like any liquid does. On the left here, you see all the different contributions to global sea level rise. The blue line there on the left is the observed, and then the sum of all the contributing processes. And so on the right, you can see globally what's going on with sea level rise versus what's going on in the United States. And so initially back in the 20s, we were having, well, you can just basically see that the slope's a little bit different. We have a little bit steeper slope in the US than the rest of the world. And that has pushed us kind of over the edge. In most of the parts of the country, we're seeing higher rates than we are globally. And that's significant. And I'll show you some places where that's even more the case. Next. So basic variables that cause sea level to change. As the ocean warms, it expands. We also have circulation changes with different density and salinities going on, changes of the ocean currents. We have terrestrial water storage and groundwater influences. Local subsidence is a big deal, the vertical land motion, whether the land's going up or down over time. And that can be either caused by tectonics or oil and gas groundwater extraction causing subsidence, or isostatic rebound, which we'll talk about it in a little bit. And then obviously the exchange of water stored on land. Sea ice, again, doesn't really displace any water as it melts, but land ice will add to the volume. Next. So we've seen since 1920 to now about a foot of sea level rise in the U.S. This is going to average around the country. Obviously, projections vary by location. And what we're poised to see is the same amount of sea level we've seen in the last 100 years will occur in the next 30 years. And you just probably saw an article that just came out. Folks in Denmark have been looking at the Greenland ice sheet, and we're poised to see almost another foot of sea level rise again by 2050, which is what the Sea Level Rise Tech Report talks about. So we're going to see a profound shift in coastal flooding over the next 30 years, and that's going to result in even more damages, possibly 10 times more often damaging floods than we have seen in the past. Next. So the technical report, just a little background, a lot of times these sea level projections, they get attributed to NOAA. They say, oh, those are the NOAA projections. It's actually a federal interagency sea level rise task force that develops these. So these agencies are involved: FEMA, USGS, Corps, NASA, NOAA, EPA, and DOD. It's the most up-to-date sea level projections available. They're going to be input into the National Climate Assessment, and obviously they inform a lot of sea level rise adaptation plans at all kinds of scales. Next. So what's in it? It's an update of the scenarios globally and for the US and regional and local levels. Update from the 2017 was the last technical report, and that went into NCA 4. Also this time, and I'll talk about all these items, there are observed trends going back from 1970 and then extrapolating, so 1970 to 2019, and then extrapolated out to 2050 to show us sort of what trajectory are we on and how that compares to the different sea level projections. And then there's some information in there on some new gridded extreme water level probabilities that came up yesterday. It's a new product we're working on, and it's trying to expand the existing work of the flood frequencies at the NOAA tide gauges and trying to extrapolate that onto a 1 degree grid so that you don't have to, if you're in between tide gauges, you can get an answer. And that's based on historical water levels, so it's not looking into the future. And then a description of all the science data, and there's a couple of like case studies and things in there in the tech report about the latest science we're working on. Next. All right, I mentioned most of these already. The takeaway, we're going to see almost another foot in the next 30 years. So the rate is definitely increasing. So we're starting to see, instead of a linear trend, which if you look at most of NOAA's tide gauge sea level trends, it's just a linear regression. And in the case of like Fort Pulaski and Charleston, that they go back to the 20s, and sea level was not rising as fast back then, so it kind of keeps the slope down a little bit. But now if you look in the last 30 or even 10 years, that slope is increasing. So we're starting to see more of a quadratic curve than a linear. We're seeing more extreme tides. Blair showed that to us yesterday. Very much. I'll talk a little bit about that as well as some of the projections on high tide flooding. And we're going to see a profound shift. So we're going to see, like Blair showed yesterday, we're going to see much more moderate flooding instead of just minor. So we're going to be tipping over that threshold more and more. So especially for our low-lying coastal cities. Next. And when you're looking out beyond 2050, what really the report talks about is how important emissions are. All of the global climate models that they use that in the NCA 4, they were called representative concentration pathways, RCPs. They're doing them a little differently in AR6. They're called SSPs, and they're based on temperature, and that I won't go into the details there, but it's based on each half a degree centigrade increase in temperature we're going to see. But what really matters is how much emissions we're going to continue to put into the atmosphere. If we're go along with what we're doing now, we could see upwards of 7 feet by 2100 of sea level rise. There's much more uncertainty when we get out past 30 years. We've actually dialed in a little bit better than we had in the past, in the next 30 years. But after 2050, it really is highly dependent on the future emissions. I'll discuss that a little bit in a minute. And we talk about how the continued observations, not only at the gauges, but global observations from satellite, altimetry, all these are very important, and basically as indicators of what's going on, and to try to figure out what's going on locally, we have to have more observations. And that would include remote sensing information too, because for us to be able to get a handle on what's going to be flooding, we have to have good elevation data, as we saw yesterday with Georgia, the new LIDAR that was collected. It's very important to map things correctly. Next. So from 2020 to 2050, this map kind of shows you intermediate low and intermediate high, and just how it does vary based on the region for a lot of different factors. The main factor in the next 30 years is the vertical land motion differences. You can see up there in Alaska, some parts, it's actually, especially Juneau and places like that, tectonically, it's being uplifted. There's a little bit more uplift going on in the Pacific Northwest as well. So that's keeping up with sea level rise. Other places like Louisiana and some parts of the East Coast, including along southeast. We're undergoing subsidence, and that's not helping us because the land's falling as well as sea level rising, and that increases the rate. Next. So from 2017, what's changed? Now, these are the global curves here, not specifically for the southeast or anything, but it's just to kind of show you the differences. One big difference is there's no extreme scenario anymore. That's the top one there. You see the light blue dashed line. The thinking is that in the 2017 report, we did have an extreme. It was 2.5 meters. We're thinking we're not going to get to that height by 2100, but we probably will after that. So these projections go out to 2150. So not saying that we're not going to get to the extreme, but just not by 2100. So we maybe bought a little more time on some of the more extreme projections. But then you can also see at 2050 how the projections have sort of compressed. So we're getting much more certainty that they're all going to be somewhere within that 1 foot range there by 2050. So that's important. So that helps us maybe not over design things for the next 30 years. But then once you get out past 2050, you see that we're right back up to they actually are exactly the same for the rest of the scenarios by 2100. And then there's still a lot of uncertainty as they spread out. Next. Specifically in the southeast, just to give you an idea how they've changed a little bit, the lower scenarios have gone up a little bit, not a whole lot, maybe 0.2, 3 feet. And then the higher scenarios actually have gone down a little bit. This is that pick 2080. So you can see Fort Pulaski, we've gone down a little bit from 4.3 feet to 3.51 feet. It's a little bit of a drop. Next. So these are the SSPs I was talking about, and this is what gives us our, as you go out past 2050, the uncertainty where we're going to be, and it has to do with the amount of global temperature increase we're going to see. And generally, they're going to be by half a degree. And so if you look at the tech report, it gives you the probabilities of the different scenarios based on the SSPs. Generally, we're in the kind of the intermediate to intermediate high is right about the mean of the probabilities there for nationally. Next. What else is new? And I talked about this is extrapolation data. So what you're seeing here, this is actually the southeast region. The up and down jagged is actual tide observations from 1970. And basically this has been average for all the gauges in the southeast. And you can see the observed extrapolation line, essentially, best fit curve, kind of quadratic or polynomial. And then as you get out past 2020, then we're extrapolating and then overlaying that on the projection curves, which start in year 2000, actually 2005. But we've for this purposes, we've moved them back to 2000 to be consistent with how they were done in 2017 report. And you can see that right along in the southeast, we're kind of following that between intermediate and intermediate high curve by 2050. Next. It's just, there's another tool that NASA has. I didn't put the URL here, but if you just Google NASA sea level rise tools, I think it's called Interagency Sea Level Rise Projection Tool. You can click on Fort Pulaski or just the southeast. It gives you the observed extrapolation, the observed to 2020, and then the extrapolated, and then you can overlay those on the different curves to see where you're what the relationship is there. So again, you can see we're somewhere in between. That red line is in between the intermediate high and intermediate by 2050. Next. Okay, again, this is kind of reiterating that, the farther out we go, the less confidence we have. We've got to really dialed in right now, to 2020, it's because based on observed data, we know what's happened. Going out to 2050, we have a pretty good understanding of the variables. The emissions don't play as much of a role. yet because the significant contribution of the ice sheets is scheduled to come kind of later. We are going to see Greenland contributing a little more than Antarctica at this point, and then eventually emissions kind of take over. So we have low confidence in what's going to happen with how the ice sheets were going to disintegrate and how high the temperature is going to be. That's really what's contributing to that. Next. The data is available at all the tide gauges and at a 1 degree longitude latitude grid. So no matter where you are, you can get local projections at the tide gauge, and if you're between tide gauges, you can pick the closest grid cell. And it's available not just in Nokomis here, but also for the islands and Alaska. Next. Okay, zooming in locally here to Fort Pulaski, right there, Savannah Harbor entrance. You're looking at what we've seen here, and this is where I was getting at. The trend line is basically a regression. It's been there since the mid 30s. That gauge, it's an average of 3.44 millimeters per year. But sea level was fairly steady back then, and you can see here in the last since 2010 on a little uptick in the slope of that. So that's where we're starting to see this acceleration. So we've seen about a foot in the last 100 years. And again, we're going to see that start to become more of a quadratic line, or I mean a curve. And so that's going to see the rates increase over the next 30. Next. And as Blair showed yesterday, that's contributing to the number of high tide flood events we've seen. Going back to 1920, we really didn't even have any. And now we're starting to see more and more. We've broken records every couple of 3 years. It all depends on the way we count the high tide flood events, at least on the NOS side. And by the way, we use a little bit different criteria for that than Weather Service. Weather Service uses it for warning criteria, which is really what floods at different levels. We're doing it more at NOS about statistically trying to average that across the country so that we can count and compare the West Coast to the East Coast, for example. So the thresholds are a little different, but the result is still the same. We're seeing the increase, and that can be driven by things like El Nino, La Nina. We tend to see higher water levels on the West Coast and East Coast during El Nino. If we have increased number of tropical, extratropical surge events, that can also increase the number of events. But generally, we're just seeing this increase, and it's due to sea level change. Next. So in 2000, we've seen about an average. This is around the country, not just here in the Southeast. So much higher in some locations. 2 days a year. Now we're seeing almost twice as much as that kind of average nationally, and eventually we're looking at up to almost 20 times more frequent by 2050. Next. This is a new plot that our folks at co-ops have been working on. I really like this. This is for Fort Pulaski. So you're seeing the observed there with a dashed squiggly line all the way up to 2020. You see the projections there starting at 2005. And then you can see these thresholds, mean high water. That's what we typically use for, that's a tidal datum we use for, building docks and piers. We don't want things to flood. So that's become a pretty good proxy for above ground. Matter of fact, the Hurricane Center uses the mean high water as a proxy for above ground when they do their surge predictions. And also the threshold or minor high tide threshold is, and so you can see where we're going to start to cross those and have basically mean high water is going to be all the time. And it projects that out by decade. Next. We just published this report. We do it once a year with our sister office co-ops. High tide flooding projections. You can Google this. Just do NOAA high tide flooding outlook, annual outlook, and it has this map on there. You can see we've mapped the layers, minor, moderate, and major, which are the NOS thresholds. I'll just tell you that it's not the Weather Service thresholds, not the maps that Blair was showing you yesterday. A little bit different thresholds, but the idea is these areas are going to start to be impacted. The Fort Pulaski gauge had about 8 events in 21, and you're looking at by 2022 next year 6 to 10 events, and then 2050, 70 to 90 high tide flood days. Next. Okay, this gets into the resilience part of the equation. So, there's a ton of different factors that cause coastal cities and municipalities and even rural coastal areas to be impacted. Sea level rise, I would call it as an exacerbator to the existing system. Well, we have all these things that are continuing going to happen. We're still going to have rainfall, potentially more extreme. We're going to have storm surge still. We still are going to be dealing with the groundwater table coming up and down as sea level increases in places like Florida and parts of Georgia. Probably it's going to impact the groundwater potentially with saltwater intrusion. Also, the freshwater water table floats on top of the salt. It's less dense, so that's going to push the groundwater table higher, which means you can't absorb as much rainwater if the groundwater table is right at the surface. We've got the land continuing to sink in some places. So all this is going to keep on going, and sea level is just going to kind of make things worse over time. It's the climate component of all this is, you see the news after every event saying, "Oh, is this climate change? Is climate change making make this storm so bad?" That attributing climate change to any individual event is a really hard thing to do. But if you plot these things out like we're doing over time, you see the numbers, and what these indicators are showing us is that yes, over time, the same event that happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago is going to be worse now because of sea level rise. That is pretty much a fact. Next. And that shown here, as we increase sea level rise, the floodplain is going to expand and go inland. We're working on this right now in the federal government, reinstituting the federal flood risk management standard. And that is the idea that our currently mapped floodplain, and we got an update on that from the Georgia folks yesterday about the new maps that FEMA has. The FEMA maps, the 1% does not include future conditions and does not include sea level change. So they do map individual storm events with the dunes, the 540 rule and all that, but they don't include future sea level rise. And we're working on that with FEMA and trying to map future sea level or future base flood elevations and how they'll be impacted with rising sea level. And that's going to cause the floodplain to expand inland, and that's going to do a lot of things. It's going to make more people exposed and potentially vulnerable. And as that line moves inland, of course, they're going to more of a graduated type of mapping product eventually, I think, trying to couple with risk rating 2.0. So trying to get away from the in and out 1% line and have it be more of a graduated flood risk gridded product. But the point is that there's going to be a lot of people that are not insured because they're not inside the line, and as that line moves, they're going to become more and more vulnerable. Next. And when we live at the coast, we have this problem of gravity, where this is an example. If you think of places like Charleston or Savannah, we have an urban setting. We have some sort of flood protection, seawall, if you will, or it could just be a marsh buffer. We do have to pipe that water that falls over the land out to the estuary, to the stormwater system. But when the stormwater system backs up with tides or surge, that water can't go anywhere. Most of the stormwater systems on the East Coast are gravity fed. They're not pumps. So if you have extreme rainfall at the same time you have high tides, it basically can't drain. Charleston, I know, is doing a lot to try to fix that, putting backflow preventers on the outlets. But this is a problem when you don't have gravity working in your favor, because basically the head is lower than it was before. Head is basically the difference between the rain coming in at the streets versus where it leaves. and the head difference goes down when you have water in the system at the coast. So it's going to require pumps, and that's exactly what New Orleans does. We're doing the same thing in Charleston. We're installing pumps to push that water out. So that's going to become the new normal. Next. So implications for planning, again, it's kind of good news in that we have a narrower range of possibilities for the next 30 years. It's a little bit more certainty. Potentially we won't overbuild, but a lot of the structures we're building right now, let's be honest, are going to last more than 30 years. So we do have to start looking beyond that. We have less certainty as that goes on. Potentially some more time to plan for the highest extremes, because right now it doesn't look like we're going to get to that extreme level by 2100, but eventually we might get there. And this idea, this tidal shift, as we and a matter of fact, in NOAA, we're working on that right now. So every 19.6, oh, sorry, 18.6 years, roughly 19 years, NOAA has to update the National Tidal Datum Epic. It's NTDE. We're currently on the 1986 to 2001 epic, and we just finished up the next epic. We have to run all the numbers and essentially average the tide over that entire period. And what that captures is the moon declination that you've probably read articles about the wobble. Every 19 years, the moon kind of changes its orbit and gets a little bit closer to the sun than other times. We have to account for that. We know that happens. It's not something new. It's been going on since before us, but we do have to account for that. And that sets our legal tidal datums, mean high water, mean low water, mean sea level. And those are going to be changing in around 2025. They're going to publish. So mean high water as we know it now is going to go up here on the southeast. And that's good job security for all of us that are doing mapping, because we have to remap everything. And that'll be incorporated into the VDatum, the NOAA VDatum tool that we use for doing that. Next. So we try to promote is this idea of risk management framework, and that use a higher scenario if you're planning for something farther out, projections, or something more critical it needs to be around for a while or not be compromised at all due to flooding, say a hospital or access point for evacuation. Plan for a higher scenario, but also we have to realize cost is a factor. So there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to be done based on the risk. And then for natural infrastructure, for anything like marsh restoration, that kind of thing, to try to promote marsh migration, then in the near term, 30 years, we may have a little bit better information so we don't overbuild. Next. Just as an example of what some of the local areas are doing and how they're selecting scenarios to use for planning, this is what Charleston has done in their sea level strategy. They're actually updating that as we speak. These are actually the 2017 projections, but they went out 50 years and they used a range from 2 to 3 feet. This is similar to the freeboard that we're using for the FFRMS, but it goes out to 2070 and it kind of straddles that intermediate curve line. 3 foot for more critical infrastructure. Next. So all bad news? Hopefully not. I think we have a really good understanding of what's going on now. We've spent, I think, in my case, this is me at my desk, trying to figure out, gosh, it's all doom and gloom, but we have better numbers. We're a little bit more confident in the short term, and I think we can safely say, we have a good idea what's going on. We do have to accept that there is some uncertainty. We're not going to dial these numbers into exact decimals, but we kind of know what's coming. I feel like there's no excuse to not start planning for this now. And go ahead, next slide. We've tried to connect people with resources to do that. We have on Digital Coast, we have a coastal inundation topics page. This came out when we published the sea level rise tech report, and it's got all the resources in there for pretty much everything I just mentioned. The tech report, all of the co-ops data sets, all of the science and and publications behind that, as well as access to tools and elevation data sets that we provide. Next. You all know that we do have our sea level rise viewer. We're constantly updating that based on the best available DEMs. We just remapped Georgia based on your new LiDAR. Just remapped South Carolina. We're getting ready to remap most of Florida, including for the first time, the Everglades, which has been missing. Next. So our viewer has been used in the past. I know the Tybee Island has a sea level rise adaptation plan, and part of that was to look at raising Route 80. As we know, even just 3 feet above Minnehaha high water, it floods that causeway. I had talked to I don't know if he's still the mayor, but it used to be the mayor, that he had nightmares of people getting stranded out on Tybee before a tropical storm, because the access will be underwater before the island will be. So using this visualization has helped them, try to come up with a plan for raising US 80. I don't know what the current status of that is, but next. I mentioned the stormwater issues. We do have a stormwater tool that if you go to assess it, it gives you, you can put in some parameters and pick a threshold, and it tells you when your high tide flooding days if you put in a certain number of days, it'll print you out a report. If you really want more detailed, you can put in an actual NABD 88 elevation. So you can try that out. We're going to take components of this tool, I think, and try to build an easier type of calculator, similar to what the core has, but more, the core calculator is more for, engineering purposes. This is going to be a little bit more for planning. Next. Yep, that's it. All right. Any questions?
That was great. Thank you so much, Doug. Yeah, I didn't see any questions in the chat so far, but feel free to come off of mute if you have a question. Some of the things that I definitely took away from your presentation was that moderate is the new normal for assessing this data, and that planning, it typically takes historical data and uses it as its foundation for decision makers, but maybe projection data should also be equally assessed, if not more so than historical data, because like we saw yesterday, within the last 10 years, we are reaching the more moderate levels. And if we're going out for an additional 30 years and doing master planning and doing, comprehensive planning for our coast, then we need to be accounting for the 2050 projections instead of, the historical references. So I really appreciated all of that. I gained a lot from your presentation. Thank you so much. Any questions from the audience?
This is Brian Schott, Corps of Engineers. I've got a question, maybe a little outside the presentation you did, but with regards to the CO2 emissions and thermal expansion of the oceans, are we talking like if in some crazy scenario we were able to stem the tide of these emissions, or with regards to that expansion, are we talking decades? Are we talking centuries as far as, returning that heat from the ocean up to the atmosphere to cool it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't bring it up, but if you go, someone put it in the chat, the sea level rise tool that NASA has, they have a really good, if you use that and you go down to the bottom, you'll see the graph that I showed in my presentation, but if you go down to the bottom, it has all the different factors in a bar chart and how they change over time as we go out. And what you'll see is that the ocean expansion has been a major contributor up to now, but it's going to become a smaller part of the equation once we go out and when the ice sheets really start cranking, and we've seen Greenland contributing. So same with vertical land motion. That has been a big factor too. but that will become less of a factor when these other things start to kick in. But you're exactly right. So with the idea with the either the RCPs or the SSPs, whatever you want to call them, is what emission scenario are we going to be on? And originally with the RCPs, there was 3 or 4 of them. I think it was 8.0 was like the runaway. We're just going to keep things going as we are now. 4.5 is sort of we're going to start to reduce and eventually kind of plateau. And then there was a 2.6, which we've kind of already blown that window now. So if we plateau and reduce, and that's still why it's become a major thing with the Paris agreement and all that, is that if we still can stem the amount of CO2 and the warming that we're going to see, but we are at some point we are locked into a certain amount of sea level change and warming at this point. How we if we can plateau and start to go down, yeah, over time. Now there's a lag there, right? The ocean it takes a while for it to absorb the heat. I think it probably takes equally as long to give it back up, but it's also storing an awful lot of carbon. So if we can reduce the emissions, then we can store more carbon and we can potentially bring it back down. There is going to be a lag though, and that's part of the uncertainty in the process, right? So how much we reduce the emissions versus all the other natural processes we already kind of have a handle on. That's why those curves are all spread out as we get farther out. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
It does. Thank you. Appreciate
yeah.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Doug, Jared Lopes with the Corps Engineers here. Thank you. That was a phenomenal presentation, and really just breaking down the 2017 to 2022 updates itself, I think was extremely helpful. It's nice to see that somewhat simplified for us to take a look and how those scenarios change. I had a question on how we update and assess some of our sea level change scenarios. So like Chatham County has the Smart Sea Level Sensors Program, which is definitely one of the most expansive and robust kind of networks of just gauges out there at the moment that I'm aware of. Can things like that be used to sort of further calibrate and sort of work towards updating some of these scenarios at the local level?
Well, observations are key, for any kind of validation. I think the caveat being that for sea level trends, when we're looking at a statistically significant amount of years to be able to do a trend line, we're generally talking period of record of at least 30 years, if not ideally like 38 years. I don't know why it's 38, but the statisticians tell me it's 38 to be able to give an idea. And what that does is over that amount of time, it takes out the natural variability that's going on over maybe potentially a decade or two or whatever. We do have periods where the decadal stuff with the Atlantic decadal oscillation can cause it to go up and down. And then there's the issues with the Gulf Stream slowing or not, and that's a whole nother thing. But long story short, you have to have a long enough period of record to be able to come up with a trend to be able to use to calibrate. But I would say that when you're doing for things like high tide events, when you have a threshold or something like that, then the local gauges, and this is what most of the communities are using them for. And I think Sakura, that's the group that's part of the I know Deborah Hernandez is involved in that for the Southeast. Sakura is this group that does observations as part of the IU's program, funded a little bit through NOAA. Anyway, to try to do more sensors like that, they can be used to validate locally what's going on. Like if you have, let's say there's a projection the Weather Service puts out for a certain height of water, at let's say the Charleston or Pulaski gauge or something like that, or a Hurricane Center puts out a forecast for storm surge. These gauges can be used to see what's going on like very locally, because there's a lot of issues with back bays and up river systems where it affects the height of the water, as you know, versus at the open coast there. So that's the whole non-linearity thing we were talking about yesterday with sea level rise. So having those gauges there helps with calibrating models, like local models, or even just knowing as an emergency manager, hey, if this, I know that if the Pulaski gauge is this, we know from observations over like just a couple years that up here on this river, whatever, it's going to be higher. We just know that just the fact. So that kind of thing would help.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. Thank you. And I guess I was just going to add on the Highway 80 front, I know they've done some sort of spot elevation repairs to reduce the sunny day flooding issues, but the future of that roadway is obviously subject to future discussion.
Yeah, I don't know if they were, it seems like that would have been a good infrastructure bill project. I don't know if that is something that's being looked at or not.
Yeah.
All righty. Thank you guys so much. We are going to transition over to our next presentation, which is given by Ms. Tasha Allen. And she's going to discuss some of our nature-based solution options.
All right, thanks, Pamela. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you great.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks, Pamela and the Silver Jackets team for putting this workshop together and this opportunity to share. My name is Tasha Allen, and I am the Southeastern Caribbean Learning Services Coordinator, and I also work with Doug at the Office for Coastal Management. And really my role there is to really help provide technical assistance to our partners on the different digital coast resources like the ones that Doug showed. So we've been hearing, a lot about coastal hazards and their impacts and the data that can really help us assess the different impacts and risks. But what I'm going to talk about are some actions we can take to kind of help lessen some of those impacts using natural resources. And if you were here yesterday, you heard Ashby Worley from the Nature Conservancy. She shared some really useful decision support tools to help with marsh migration analysis and open space planning. And then later today, you'll hear about some additional nature-based solutions related work from the Coastal Management Division. So I want to complement the resources that you'll hear about and you have heard about that really are focused on kind of addressing some key questions that we get from communities about nature-based solutions, such as, how do we get conversations started to, engage communities on what nature-based solutions are and what they'd like to see in their community. Also, we get questions around, where can I get information on the effectiveness of nature-based solutions to reduce coastal hazard impacts? Are these resources really helping us and really working? And then we get questions on, what is green infrastructure nature-based solutions cost and what benefits do they provide? And then how do I learn more? And I want, examples of on the ground. So next slide, please, Pamela. So just going to give an overview of the products that I'm going to talk about, just how they're used, and then opportunities for you to learn more. Okay, next slide, Pamela. Okay, so I'm going to go into more detail on one of the resources that's intended to help you learn an approach to identify nature-based solutions. You also hear me use the word green infrastructure. I'll use those interchangeably, really to reduce coastal hazard impacts and help you develop the beginnings of a community green infrastructure plan. And then I'm going to go into some additional resources that are going to help address some of those questions that I just shared. So just to give you a quick overview, I'm going to be talking about this tool called Nature-Based Solutions for Coastal Hazards, the Basics. We initially developed this learning product as part of our in-person and virtual trainings that we conduct on nature-based solutions. However, talking to a few partners, they said that this what we call this part one, this kind of basics, this overview of nature-based solutions would really be a great outreach and community engagement tool to really get people familiar with what are nature-based solutions, how do we start talking about those? What ways can we start engaging communities in conversations on both, what hazards are we seeing, and then what nature-based solutions will we like to see in our community? So Pamela, this is where I'm going to go over to sharing my screen to do my live demo. And hopefully I can get this right. Okay, so can folks see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, all right, great. Just want to make sure. Okay. So what I'm going to do is start out by showing the nature-based solutions for coastal hazards, the basics. And how you get there is you go to our Digital Coast website, and I'll share a link here in a second in the chat. And so this resource is considered one of our training resources. So we'll just click on this training icon there. And then we have a list of different types of trainings that we offer. We have scheduled trainings, and then we also have these on-demand products. Because I'm familiar with this resource, I know that it's under interactive modules. So I'm going to click on this interactive modules link here. And then we have several filters on the site. We call these focus areas. I know that this is under green infrastructure. So over here on the left-hand side, I'm just going to click on green infrastructure. And then it brings up several of our green infrastructure resources that are considered interactive modules. So I'm going to click here on the nature-based solutions for coastal hazards, the basics. And then let me get this, I'm going to share this in the chat. So if you'd like to follow along with me, do that right there. Okay. And so what this resource does is it helps you learn an approach for identifying your community's coastal hazard issues, ecosystem services that can help reduce those hazard impacts, and then nature-based solution practices that can provide those ecosystem services. So we're going to step you through that process. And then what this does is it really helps you develop the beginning of a nature-based solutions plan. And then also to increase accessibility, we also offer this in Spanish. So what I'm going to do is just click on this begin training. And then what it's going to do is just bring us into our kind of entry spot here. So I'm just going to start by clicking on this start button here. And then what we do is we start you off with a case study that shares how one county's experience with extreme rainfall and flooding. So it walks you through this case study, just what they've been experiencing, a lot of what we've been talking about over the past couple of days. And what this does is just really help set the stage, recognizing that many communities are facing similar issues related to flooding, and also provides a reason on why you want to consider using nature-based solutions. So as I click through this case study, you can see that they've had hurricane impacts, they've had increased precipitation, and then what we do is we start to talk to you about how this county chose to reduce current and future flooding impacts using nature-based solutions. And so this kind of walks through their approach. They took a county-wide approach to implement nature-based solutions at multiple scales. So for example, they've looked at areas, how they conserve large areas of natural land. They've also looked at what they can do in neighborhood and parcel levels to reduce stormwater runoff. And then they also looked at what they can do with community members, such as installing rain gardens or using rain barrels. And one really cool part of this effort, which I thought is really neat, is that they worked with schools and students to have them install projects on the schools and property. And that's an example on the right-hand side of a rain garden at one of the local schools. And then next what we do is just kind of give you a quick orientation to our trainings that we provide where, so this is kind of that first step. And so you would take this part one, and then you would, to continue your learning, we have in-person trainings, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we also have a virtual training. So next what I'm going to do is just kind of start to orient you through our thought process, that approach that we recommend you take to identify nature-based solutions to reduce coastal hazards. The goal is to help communities be better prepared for flooding events rather than reacting to immediate needs. And we do this by having you, and when I say you, I really encourage you and partners, think through a process that will help you identify what green infrastructure or nature-based solutions make the most sense for your community based on the hazard impacts you're trying to reduce. And you can see that thought process on the screen here. And so I want to go over just a quick example what that really looks like in the real world. So what I'm going to do is just click on this example one at the top here. And what it does is it just brings up examples. So let's say this community is experiencing coastal flooding and you want to reduce it. So we can mitigate or reduce coastal flooding by using coastal flood control. So that's that ecosystem service that we're looking for. And then, so then we want to ask ourselves, okay, well, how do we get flood control? Well, that can be done through, for example, conserving marsh, having open space like this park, for example, near the water. And as you can see in the top photo, this park is holding flood water, and it's not really impacting our daily lives. And so we'll come back to some of these steps in this approach and talk about them in more detail, and also what some of the terms like ecosystem services mean. So I'm going to kind of continue along. There are several other examples here. So if your community is dealing with stormwater, you can see what types of green infrastructure provide water infiltration, and then you can also look at if you're trying to mitigate erosion. What practices can provide wave attenuation. So there's some different examples there based upon sort of what challenges you're dealing with. We also provide a definition of nature-based solutions, which can be really helpful if you're new to nature-based solutions, or you're working with community members that aren't familiar with these terms. Our definition of nature-based solutions is very broad. So it includes existing natural resources like dunes, parks, trees, wetlands, and then also with that, we also talk about using engineering techniques mixed with natural materials like plants and soils and rocks to mimic those natural processes, such as absorbing water, slowing down wave energy. So some of those examples would be rain gardens, bioswales, hybrid shoreline practices, pervious pavement. So moving along in this process, we also think that, you can't really talk about nature-based solutions without talking about the benefits. Our primary focus is to reduce coastal hazard impacts. However, there are many other benefits that I think, people, especially if you're working with community members and really want to have them engage, they get excited about some of these other things, such as, cleaning our water or our air, providing recreation, also, wildlife habitat or employment. And, although it can take longer in your planning process to engage community members, we think that it's really important to take the time to really talk with people in your community to find out, what it is that they'd like to see happen in their community, and what is it that, they're concerned about. That way you're not exacerbating or causing additional issues with using nature-based solutions such as displacement, for example. So to help document what you discuss, we provide green infrastructure plan worksheet that looks like this. This is an example of what we have you go through, and you can actually download it in two formats, PDF or in Word. And so if you're coming to one of our trainings, you would actually start working through this process that I'm going to step you through, and you could download this, and then we have you bring this worksheet to the training, and then we build upon that. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in that as well. So what I'm going to do is start us out with this step one, and this is where you identify your coastal hazards impacting your community. And you'll see part of the worksheet here that asks you to identify what coastal hazard. And if folks are new to coastal hazards, or they need a visual, we have listed several different coastal hazards that are happening in along the coast, and also we include the Great Lakes because that's another area where we work. And then we also include case studies in each of these steps that describe how a community has approached using nature-based solutions to address the coastal hazard impacts. So I do have a quick question for you all, and I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm just curious. Let me see if I find the chat here. What flooding issues are you seeing in your community? So I'm going to ask you to share some of those in the chat. Just curious what's kind of happening, since that's what we have you do. And that step one is really think about, okay, what flooding are you seeing, or other impacts as well, depending upon where you're from. Okay, so we see, yeah, flooding on roads, definitely. High tide flooding, yes. I know that's a huge issue in Charleston as well. Stormwater rain bombs, yep, we've been having a lot of those recently. Yeah, the flooding that may not cause major impacts, but might inconvenience us as well. So, okay, we'll keep sharing those. I'm gonna keep moving us along into the next step of this. So the next step is where you start to identify where that hazard is happening in your community. So, you've identified, for example, maybe stormwater runoff is happening, and then where is that happening? It could be a specific location, like a certain neighborhood, or maybe it's a larger scale problem. And so we have several resources that can help you start to identify, where those might be if you're not familiar with that. And then if you were here yesterday, John McCombs from my office demoed the coastal flood exposure mapper that really helped you identify where where those flooding hazards are occurring in your community and who and what from your community are exposed to those hazards. So that's a great kind of starting point to kind of get an idea of where this is happening. And then of course, because hopefully you'll be using these resources with local communities, you'll be collecting that local knowledge too. That's invaluable, finding out what people are actually seeing and observing and dealing with when these events are happening. Okay, so stepping along, we're going to go to step 3. So this is where we want to identify ecosystem services that mitigate the impacts. We don't want to jump right into what are those practices, but first we want to figure out, what can we use that will help us either retain water, stormwater, infiltrate water, help reduce, wave energy. And so when we talk about ecosystem services, we talk about that kind of in a way of benefits from nature. We get so many freebies from nature, such as food, jobs, aesthetics, and it can also protect us. And so really those ecosystem services are the benefits society gets from nature. And so this is a little bit of background information if folks are, kind of new to this term. And I like to think of ecosystem services. What would nature be doing with all this excess rainwater, for example, if it was in its natural state, so there was no development? So if we just had wetlands and trees and native plants and soils, what would it be doing? And, it would be absorbing that water. And then we have this really cool visual. So if you click on this ecosystem services button up here, we have this really cool visual that kind of just helps you see the different types of benefits or ecosystem services that the coastal environment is providing us. And then what you can do is you can actually click on one of these, so coastal buffering, and then you learn more about what that provides us to help reduce those coastal hazard impacts. So coastal buffering, coastal flood control, stormwater retention. It's just a great way to kind of learn a little bit more about this. And then again, we have a case study that talks more about how, community is using these ecosystem services to reduce those coastal hazard impacts. So I have another question for you all so that you're kind of practicing working through this process with me is, I'm going to put this in chat. What ecosystem services do you need to reduce the hazard impacts happening in your community? So go back to thinking about some of those flood impacts you've been seeing in your community. And you can definitely use this graphic as a cheat sheet. But what are some of those ecosystem services that you need to be able to reduce those some of those flooding impacts? So feel free to share some of those ideas in the chat. Okay, yeah, we need stormwater retention. Yep, we have rain. Helps absorb. Yeah, coastal flood control. Yeah, water infiltration. Okay, this is great. Sometimes folks want to jump right to the actual practice, but we're going to get into that. But we like to, we probably unconsciously think about these are the things that we need, but then sometimes we'll go to an actual green infrastructure practice and think, okay, that's how we're going to get that. But we like to take this step here to think about, okay, what is it that we really need that's going to provide those benefits to reduce those coastal hazards? Okay, so then the next step is to think about, okay, now that I know that there's hazard impacts that I want to reduce, I know where those are happening. I know what type of ecosystem services I want. Now we have you think about, okay, what green infrastructure or nature-based solutions are going to provide those ecosystem services? And so what we have here is we kind of break it down, this information down to scale. So you can look at based upon, where your coastal flooding problem may be happening. You can think about maybe there's some things you can do at the landscape or watershed scale. There's also things that you can do at the community and site scale. And then also we call this kind of the shoreline scale. So what can you do along the shoreline to deal with some of the flooding issues? And then also if you click on this practices button here, we go into different types of green infrastructure practices and what scale that you traditionally see these. And then if you click on the actual name, you can actually get a visual of what that looks like, what type of practices may fall under forestry, for example, and then also the ecosystem services that forestry, tree canopy, that trees provide. And so this is a really great way to kind of help people learn about these different practices and what they actually look like. That's my neighborhood right there. I'm very excited about those bioswales. And you can just see examples of what these look like in the community. Okay, so I do have one more question for y'all. Appreciate you participating. What nature-based solutions are you seeing or would you like to see in your community to reduce the hazard impacts that we talked about? So I'm just kind of curious what's actually happening in your communities, or maybe that you would like to actually see it. Maybe you haven't started using nature-based solutions yet. And feel free to use this list up here as a cheat sheet if you're new to this topic. So yeah, forestry, conserving trees, yeah, using bioretention. So using things such as rain gardens or to use plants and materials and soil to help absorb that water. Yeah, living shorelines, so or hybrid shorelines where we can help reduce erosion issues as well. Okay, great. And then all the other sections, we have a case study that illustrates, again, the different types of nature-based solutions that communities are using to address some of their coastal hazard impacts. Okay, and then the last section is really focused on barriers and opportunities. And this is an opportunity for you to think through, okay, this is what my community is experiencing with these hazard impacts. This is where it's happening. These are the types of approaches that I would like to take. And then, what are some of those obstacles standing in the way? And then also, what are some opportunities? What can we do to possibly further these conversations and also think about how we can get this implemented? And then because we do use this as a learning resource, you do have the ability to get continuing education credits. And so you can take a final quiz. And also because we do use this to help prepare you for our in-person and virtual trainings, it just gives you a nice kind of overview of what's happening. You can also go back, if I click on this menu button here, you can go back and you can access any of these additional sections if you want to go back and have these conversations. And then also if you are going after that CEU, there's knowledge checks built in. And so you can go back and you can answer those questions. And so that is, that's this resource. And then what I'm going to do is, Pamela, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and then go back to the slides. I've got a couple other resources in the last couple of minutes that I wanted to share. Yeah, so to help continue your learning is that we have training as well. And so, if you want to take that next step to kind of continue to develop your nature-based solution strategy, and we have you work through in our in-person training topics like start to think about, okay, what are some design considerations I need to think about? What kind of maintenance might go with this type of nature-based solutions practices that I'm interested in. We start to talk about partners that need to be involved in these efforts and funding. So that's what we do in our full day in-person training. And then we also work with a local host to customize the speakers so that you're hearing from local folks that are in your community and how they're approaching and using nature-based solutions. We also have a 2-hour virtual training where we still work with a local host, and you'll still hear about local speakers. And we have you work through that part 1 so that you're getting some foundational understanding of what nature-based solutions are. And so those are kind of some learning opportunities. And then we also provide technical assistance to help you think through and work through, developing a strategy. So next slide, please. Another resource that we have is really focused on helping answer that question of, is green infrastructure really effective at reducing hazard impacts? And so we have developed this resource called the Green Infrastructure Effectiveness Database, and I'm going to put this in a link to this in the chat. If you'd like to check it out. And then we'll make sure that all of these resources are shared with you later. But the purpose of this is that it's a searchable database of literature resources that document the effectiveness of using green infrastructure to reduce coastal hazard impacts. And what you can do is you can search by location, hazard type, nature-based solutions type. You can search by specific, year. You can search by a region. And what it does is it returns a list of literatures based upon your search criteria that gives you the green infrastructure type that was used in that resource. So what you'll do is you'll get a list of literature, and then you can click on that literature, and we've basically summarized information from that. So you'll get key findings. You'll find out about the methods that were used. You'll find details on the measure of hazard mitigation effectiveness. So for example, did that study look at damages avoided, or did it look at shoreline change? And then you actually get a link to that resource. We've recently updated the database to include literature on costs and benefits of green infrastructure. And there's also literature on there on economic analysis. For example, cost benefit of nature-based solutions. We update this every year, and there is a place on the site to actually submit literature. One way that we use this is that we use it for talking points for our training and technical assistance to actually show literature studies that are showing that how green infrastructure is being used to reduce coastal hazard impacts. Okay, next slide, please.
Just so you're aware, Tasha, we cut into your time by 5 minutes, so this is now your new 5-minute warning.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I was down. I have my timer up, and I was down to like 30 seconds, and I was like, okay, I need to get through this.
You're good. You got 4 minutes now.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll get through this quickly. Also, additional questions that we get around from communities about nature-based solutions is, what does it cost? So we have put together this quick reference that's focused in on cost consideration and estimates. So thinking about land acquisition costs, thinking about maintenance cost. And we do have examples in there of cost information. It is based upon a best available literature searches. Then we also have that's part of this kind of, I guess I would say, sort of this package of quick references is we also have a quick reference on, how do I choose an economic methodology? So, a lot of federal funding sources are requiring benefit cost analysis, for example. Maybe you want to make sure that your investment in nature-based solutions is going to pay off. And so our economics team has put together this great resource on just giving a little bit of introduction on different types of economic methodologies, and then also, which one maybe you need based upon what you're trying to accomplish. And then I talked a little bit about the benefits earlier, but we also have one that goes into just the different types of practices and benefits. And that's a great outreach piece, especially if you're talking to folks that maybe are new to this, this topic area. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then we know that everyone's trying to identify ways to finance and fund nature-based solutions. So we actually have 2 resources that we put together for this to help really kind of inform those discussions and decisions. The first one is a quick reference, and what it does is it highlights different funding and financing options with examples of how that's being used on the ground. And then we also have a webinar series where we actually are highlighting. So I'm going to put two links in here. This is to the quick reference, the funding and financing quick reference. And then we have a webinar series that highlights different funding and financing sources. So you can go to this site here. I'll put this link in here. These resources, pretty much the one I just shared, and then this one that's a link to both our recorded and upcoming webinars, go kind of hand in hand. So you can watch past webinars on different funding and financing sources. So what we do in those is that we feature an expert on that funding or financing source. And then also they talk about ways that that's been used. I'm really excited. Our last webinar, which was done about a month ago, was really focused on overcoming barriers to access funding. And we had an amazing speaker, Dr. Angela Chalk. And she is a community-based organization that works with communities to do nature-based solutions. And she had some amazing tips and lessons learned that were very practical. So I encourage you to listen to that. And then also we have upcoming webinars. So I just encourage you to check back on that. And then I'll share my email as well if you'd be interested in learning more about that. And then next slide, just got one additional resource here. So I went over a lot of different nature-based solutions resources. We have this topics page that's focused on that. It's the different resources that we provide. And so you can go in there and you can look for the ones that I talked about today, and then additional ones if you'd like to learn more. So I'll put that link in here as well. And then just in closing, my team and I, we love to geek out on nature-based solutions. So if you'd be interested in learning any more about some of the resources I talked about or others, digging in deeper, here's I think I have a slide at the end with my contact information, but if not, I'll put that right here in the chat as well. So please feel free to call me. We can go into a lot more detail about these resources. I know that was kind of a quick fly through. So thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Up next, we have a break. It's going to be a quick one, just a quick 5-minute break. If you have any questions for Tasha, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can email her directly if it's more convenient. But yes, we'll do a 5-minute break and be back by 10:26. And we are back. I hope we got some break dancing done during this 5-minute break. It was very short, so can't do too much. All right, so next up in our lineup, we will have a speaker from the University of Georgia, Jessica Brown. Just a second to get you going, Jessica.
Good morning. Thank you, Pamela. I appreciate that. Just a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thumbs up. Okay, super. Well, I do hope everyone had a chance to get up and move around a little bit. And really excited. What a fantastic workshop so far yesterday and today. As Pamela mentioned, Jessica Brown, I serve as a public service faculty with Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant at the University of Georgia, and I have the honor of being based in Brunswick, Georgia, kind of toward the south end of our coast. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to share with you a few recently and soon to be released tools that can be used in planning and assessing and communicating all about the function of stormwater control measures as we seek to increase our resiliency. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. So like many of my colleagues, this information is organized so that we can discuss the applicability of the tools themselves, and hopefully have a chance to introduce how they can be used and wrap up with where you can find it. And I really want to use my time today to introduce 3 specific tools: the Coastal Low Impact Development Inventory, the City of Brunswick's Rethinking Runoff Plan, and a suite of photo-based stormwater and operations inspection and maintenance tools. And I shared a little bit over the break. Tasha really set a great foundation for green infrastructure this morning. And this is just going to build on some of that with these tools and use some local coastal Georgia data. And each of them, as I've kind of alluded to, highlights the use of stormwater green infrastructure in low impact development. And of course, as we've already heard, that approach is much more, it's a much more diffuse approach to managing stormwater versus those of that traditional stormwater management of quickly and efficiently away. Next slide, please. So there again, kind of piggybacking what we've already heard this morning, with green infrastructure, we can treat runoff at multiple scales, but it really performs best at that on-site with site-specific measures, treating stormwater near its source, utilizing plant and soil systems, materials such as permeable pavement, and Pamela, if you could cue up that video, that'd be great. But to filter and infiltrate the stormwater. So here are a few coastal Georgia examples. Green infrastructure increases our resiliency by helping mitigate for not only the quantity of runoff, but also capturing it, storing it, as well as reducing those pollutant loads that were often found in the water. Oh, and if we can't see the water move through the permeable pavement, that's okay. We can kind of go ahead and move on in the interest of time. But here are just a few examples of some local projects. You've got a bioretention cell that was recently installed, actually during the pandemic at the Camden County Cooperative Extension. Permeable pavement, bioretention. Lots of folks are interested in seeing that more in their community. And then some rainwater harvesting, some large scale cisterns here. Next slide, please. So just kind of zooming back a little bit, most oftentimes we see green stormwater infrastructure in our more urban communities, and that's driven by the density of development and the amount of impervious surface that's there. But that's also partially because that's where we regulate it. And so the Clean Water Act prohibits discharges of pollutants into the water of the U.S. And municipalities that have conveyances or systems of conveyances, municipal separate storm sewer systems, often referred to as the MS4, that discharge into these waters and prevent pollutants from being washed or just dumped in. There is a stormwater management program is required in those MS4 communities. And that requirement is based off of population size. There again, that population, the density of development and the collection. And phase one, medium and large cities, counties with populations of greater of 100,000. For us here in coastal Georgia, we don't have any phase one larges. Most of those are phase one mediums. We've already heard references: Chatham County, Savannah, Garden City, Tybee. Phase two, those smaller urbanized areas in Georgia, Glenn County, Brunswick, Liberty, and Long counties. So when we think about areas where the need for stormwater green infrastructure is going to increase, which we've also heard about, we can start to plan for that increase and think about resiliency. So just as we think about increases in projected population in the coastal region, there's going to be a greater need and applicability. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time touching on it because we heard quite a bit about it yesterday, but there are some incentives for participating communities. You know, we've heard some about the community rating system program through FEMA and the opportunity for communities that demonstrate low impact development and stormwater management, whether participating and adopting an watershed management plan, implementing stormwater best practices, erosion sediment control devices. All of those can receive credits and reduce their rating and kind of capitalize on some of those benefits. So switching gears, as I mentioned, next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, I want to introduce these three tools. And these are all tools as you move to develop plans, comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation, community area development plans. All of these tools can be used as resources. And I think one of the things that makes them a little bit more unique is that they've all been developed, tailored, calibrated here in Georgia and been informed by those regulations, as well as the standards and guidance that our municipalities are working with. And they've been vetted by the communities by putting them on the ground. So, all right, that first tool, the Coastal Low Impact Development Best Management Practices Inventory, or the LID inventory for short. This is a project that we developed in 2016 from a grant from the Coastal Zone Management Program to identify and assess green infrastructure stormwater practices throughout the entire 11 county coastal area. In 2016 and 2017, we assessed over 220 sites, and we're currently working on a follow-up assessment for over 300 assessments currently. All the sites were verified and photographed and documented in a real-time GIS map. So actually accessing that tool, if we'll move to the next slide, I had the link earlier, but do you all ever work on something and then in reflection you find some unintended consequences or some benefits? Maybe that's just me, but one of the greatest benefits of the Coastal Low LID inventory that I want to point out is this database of local photographs. So you access that tool, you can search the map by location or practice. I'm demonstrating that by practice here, isolating all the permeable pavement practices, and this is in Savannah. That's actually the most common practice in coastal Georgia. Zoom in to select a site. Here I've selected the Liberty City Community Center. And then you can see the supporting information for that assessment, perceived effectiveness, that's based off of visual assessment, the size of it. There again, I mentioned we're looking at permeable pavement, the type of pavement, a point of contact, as well as a suite of photographs. And you can see the photographs I have here. So this has really been a beneficial tool to go in and see a lot of projects and never have to leave your desk to actually get that point in time look. But it's also a way that you can chart, because many of these are publicly accessible, a way to go and see some practices on the ground in coastal Georgia. Next slide. I mentioned our first study was conducted in 2016 and 17, and we assessed about 220 different practices. We're currently finishing up, and in that span of time, we've seen about 90 different practices added, or at least that's what we've documented thus far. In December of 2021, this was kind of the midpoint for our work. We had reevaluated 146, which was about a half of the total anticipated sites, and we noticed that about half of those, about 43% were permeable pavement, 56% bioretention, rain gardens, bioswales, kind of pulled together. Where in those assessments, the perceived effectiveness, again, that visual assessment had remained static. And another 30 to 40% actually appeared less effective based off of that perceived effectiveness, that visual assessment. So really looking to see how this visual assessment might be an indicator for some of our municipalities, how they might be able to utilize that information, as well as how in our planning process that visual assessment process might be planned for and can help us as we look to maintain and assess the efficiency of these practices. Interestingly enough, as part of the 2021-2022 study, we're also doing two very small pilot studies. We're looking at a permeable pavement infiltration study. That's some work that an undergraduate intern helped with this summer, using the simple infiltration method to evaluate permeable pavement performance. As I mentioned, it's the most common practice in coastal Georgia, so we're very interested to see how that visual assessment compares with the infiltration rate at that site, as well as collecting some cost data about construction and maintenance of practices. And there are several resources there. Again, Tasha pointed out a great one earlier about just large data sets, but this is really aimed to get at a much more local, regional level and looking at those costs. So overall, this tool is really useful to understand where these practices are, provide examples of what's working and what's not in the coastal environment, and can be used as a communication tool. And those photographs are really, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. A great benefit or a great tool to talk about the benefits of their use. Next slide, please. So the second tool I wanted to call your attention to, the LID inventory is a great way to know what we have. So now, how do we plan for it moving forward? And the city of Brunswick as rethinking runoff plan is one such example of that. So this plan is currently in its final draft stages, actually hoping to wrap that up by the end of the month. But it identifies locations where we can implement stormwater green infrastructure. And again, we're using a GIS platform to overlay flooding hotspots, choke points, storm sewer infrastructure, contours, public parcels, all of that information and location within these subwatersheds where there's opportunities for stormwater green infrastructure. And so one of the things that makes this plan unique, however, is the process that we use to develop it. So many of the locations were identified by municipal staff, but we also engaged community members, went to neighborhood planning association meetings and outreach events to identify those locations, all of which were then field verified. We did some preliminary design and compiled into the plan. I mentioned that we're finishing up that plan right now. We've recently started outreach for the final draft and taking that back to those very individuals that helped inform it. So stakeholder engagement between municipal staff, decision makers, thought leaders, residents, all of those folks that have really pulled together to put together the plan. Next slide. Thank you. So, and I would be remiss to not mention it, but this was based off some earlier work. The Adaptive Stormwater Management Plan we developed a few years ago in the city of Hinesville. And both of these, I certainly want to mention that they're both funded by the Coastal Zone Management Program. But I touched on the community engagement earlier, but these type of planning documents really help municipalities and communities envision all the possibilities and empower them to take action. Hinesville certainly started to do some of that, and I mentioned that component of preliminary design. Each potential location has information, and you can see it sort of at the bottom of the spread for the Rethinking Runoff Plan. Has information about the site, including impervious cover, what those contributions are, the treatment area, what the runoff volume is, what the potential reductions are, and some estimated costs. And those are based off of recent local projects. And having access to this information coupled with engagement really improves the communication and increases understanding when we look to utilize these tools. And then your community can be like Brunswick and take action to demonstrate and prioritize. Brunswick recently applied for a 319 grant, which was awarded, and they're actually discussing locations for future stormwater utility projects. So looking to demonstrate based off locations identified in the plan. And so this tool is really translational. I mentioned that we have two in coastal Georgia, the one in Hinesville and one in Brunswick, but this work has been modeled off of similar processes that are happening in the Northeast, in New York and New Jersey. So more information to come, but later this month, we're having a lunch workshop sharing the plan and really spending some time discussing the process and how that might be replicated. So if you're interested, I'll share that information toward the end. Next slide. Thank you. And the last tool, I think Stephen Covey is credited with the phrase "begin with the end in mind." But if we want to be resilient to increased rainfall and the impacts of compound flooding, Doug shared that fantastic graphic earlier from these practices have to be functioning, and in order to function, they must be maintained. So in 2020, with some Section 319 funding and the support of the Non-Point Source program, we developed a suite of photo-based tools for inspectors and maintenance professionals. And we found that these training resources for professionals are hard to come by. The resources are slim, and stormwater literacy, particularly when it comes to green infrastructure practices, is pretty low. So therefore, utilizing photographic examples, many which were gleaned from that LID inventory, as well as inspection checklists, fact sheets, informational videos, will help ensure that these practices are being inspected and maintained properly. Next slide, I think I have some screenshots of some of the tools that were developed. Thank you. I'm happy to share links so that you all have access to these resources. But as I mentioned, fact sheets, checklists for inspectors, as well as a 6-minute introductory video. Next slide. It was really helpful, a training that we held immediately following the development of the tools. As love to, as I think someone said earlier, kind of geek out on the data for that. But we showed that 98% of the workshop participants agreed or strongly agreed that they could put something in practice that they had learned within the first year. And that was huge. A follow-up survey that we conducted about a year ago actually showed that 44% of the permitted municipalities, those MS4s that I referenced earlier on, had included the resources in their plan updates. And so when we talk about the planning process, having it there, as well as the fact that the permitting agency approved that as being used, and based off of those 2016-17 inventory numbers, 95% of those practices that we had assessed in the inventory are located in the municipalities that have adopted the use of these tools. So when we look, we have the challenge of compound flooding. Let's also compound the impact of the tools. And one of the keystone trends in the feedback that we received, not only from this training workshop, but as well as sharing this information nationally at several events, was that the delivery format was limiting. And so primarily supervisors and project managers were able to get the time to attend the workshop and learn about the tools. And while they could take that information and the tools back to their teams, we could really increase engagement by making it more accessible. And so based off that feedback, I'm happy to share that we are in the process this fall of developing a course, an online course, to make it more accessible and equitable, and a platform to house all of this information where folks can step through it at their own time, their own pace, and still be able to utilize the material. So, to achieve our resiliency goals, we really must begin calling out maintenance in the planning process of these projects, and we need the resources to make sure that the folks tasked with doing that work, the boots on the ground, can carry out proper inspections and maintenance. And I think that certainly with this, we've illuminated the gap that we currently have, and certainly an area of improvement. And I think I am poised to wrap up. I think that next slide, I wanted to provide a few links. I mentioned earlier about our lunchtime workshop that's going to be held on September 15th. Unfortunately, I didn't have a link to put in at the time when I shared this, but please feel free to reach out and I can get you that information if you're interested in joining us to learn more. You can take a quick photo and search it later, gacoast.uga.edu. And I can also put that link in the chat where you can find all of the tools that I referenced today. and just I imagine that many of you are already familiar, but there is some fantastic technical guidance in the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual that was updated in 2016. And we've already started some conversations to update the coastal stormwater supplement to that document. And I look forward to incorporating some of the information that we've all learned about today, so that we can better plan for future conditions. So with that, do I have a few minutes for questions, Pamela, or you want to do those in the chat and move on?
Yes, you have time for questions. We have one comment from Tasha in the chat. She said, thanks for sharing these resources. Can't wait to check these out more and share with others. Having local data on cost and effectiveness will be very valuable from the for pilot studies. I wish we had that everywhere. Also, having photos of what practices look like on the ground locally is invaluable. It's so exciting to see local tools that address many nature-based solution questions.
Well, thank you for that. I'm excited that we have the opportunity to share.
So if anybody has any questions, now is a great time to come off mute and ask away, or you can use the chat box, whichever you're comfortable with.
Well, and if not, I will put my email in the chat, and Pamela, that might have saved us a couple of extra minutes to move forward with the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. And I did provide those links as we went along in the chat, so they should have those. All right. With that being said, we will transition to our next presentation from Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Coastal Resource Division, with Ms. Jennifer Klein.
Thank you. Gosh, this has just been a wealth of knowledge for the last, for yesterday and this morning. It's really exciting to see so much going on in our state.
Give me just a second, Jennifer.
Okay.
I'm almost there. Got quite a few tabs open. There we are. Hopefully that popped up for you.
Yes. For most of you are familiar with our coastal management program. But for those of you who are not, our coastal management program is funded through NOAA and the Coastal Zone Management Act. However, we are housed within Georgia's Department of Natural Resources, and so we are a state agency with a lot of federal initiatives that we work on. Next slide. Click it again. Yeah. So this has been a question, a kind of a popular topic, at least in my world lately, is talking about different state resiliency offices or state resiliency officers. And while Georgia does not have a state resilience office, all of these state agencies that are listed here at some form or another have been diligently working to include resilience into projects, planning, and efforts. For example, DNR's State Wildlife Action Plan, it's definitely incorporated there, and as well as GEMA's State Hazard Mitigation Plan, it's definitely incorporated there as well. And so we're definitely chipping away at the different agency levels. Next slide. Like a lot of agencies, we all have our districts or regions that we work in. Our coastal zone management program works with the 11 coastal counties. So the first 6 counties is our first tier, and then we go inland 1 tier due to the reach of the tide in those counties as well. So we cover the 11 counties. Next slide. So our goal, we work really closely with our providing technical assistance to our local governments, as well as training and funding. And you'll hear a little bit more about that coming up. Next slide. Our coastal management program is made up of these 4 different program areas. I work in the ocean and coastal management, and that's what I will be focusing on today. Next slide. So when we're looking at the providing the technical assistance and training and funding, this is where we really focus our efforts. And so we have specialists in these 4 focus areas. As you've heard a lot about green growth today, low impact development, and working with our locals on that. Myself, I'm the coastal hazard specialist. I work with our communities and other state and federal agencies and being the liaison and handing down some of the tools and information that we get to our local communities on community resiliency. As you can imagine, we work really closely with our GIS and planning section and our wetlands section, and they work really closely on nature-based solutions as well. So we work pretty tightly on wrapping up resiliency as a whole. Next slide. One benefit to our program is we hand out close to $1 million a year to our local governments, research institutions, and state agencies other than DNR in the form of coastal incentive grants. We have themes that these coastal incentive grants have to, their applications have to stick to, and one of them is coastal hazards and disaster resilient communities. Specifically, we have funded over $3 million in resiliency projects to date. It's obviously becoming a really hot topic and far more popular. Next slide. And really quickly, I forgot to mention on our coastal incentive grants, our RFP will be coming out the end of this month. And so if we do have anyone who is interested in applying, be on the lookout and feel free to reach out on that. One of our biggest projects that we have wrapped up in the coastal area is we've worked for, gosh, probably about the last 10 years and doing post-disaster recovery and redevelopment planning in all of our 11 Georgia counties. Through this process, we required each local government to include sea level rise rates into their planning, specifically for redevelopment planning, and shoreline change rates as well. All of our local governments, all 11 local governments, has also adopted these plans at the local level. Which makes it a little bit easier to go out and look for funding when there's a disaster or an emergency. Fortunately, we were informed by FEMA that by completing this work, Georgia was the first state in the U.S. to have a completely resilient coast based on FEMA's National Disaster Recovery Framework. So we're pretty proud about that. Next slide. Response. Our office, as you can imagine, the last several years have become really familiar with marine debris cleanup, especially after Hurricanes Matthew and Irma. And so that's one thing that we really have to focus on when it's that time of year right now. We also have a team, an unmanned aerial vehicle team, so UAVs. And we assist in doing flyovers when there is, high tide flooding events, when there is disaster events that we need to get some of this imagery for. And we have 7 licensed pilots on staff to be able to do that. Next slide. So getting into the meat of it, one of our projects that we have are just wrapping up and worked with several of our partners on this is we have pulled together a project where we did enhancing coastal resiliency with green infrastructure. We picked 2 pilot communities. We worked in Liberty County in Hinesville and the city of Tybee Island. And we ran HAZIS runs for these areas, looking at the cost benefits of green infrastructure and natural infrastructure with and without that, and with and without sea level rise, just to be able to give those local governments the vision and understanding of why these are important. And then we pulled that together into a coastal resilience guide. So it shows the different types of green infrastructure, the benefits that they provide. And then we also have a suite of model ordinances for coastal resiliency ordinances, sea level rise ordinances that are a part of that guide. We also ran future precipitation modeling for all of our 11 coastal counties so that they can have for better planning purposes. They have that to be able to use in some of these low impact development green infrastructure modeling. I also will say it's pretty exciting. Jekyll Island pulled the sea level rise model ordinance out of this, and is the first community in coastal Georgia to adopt a sea level rise ordinance here on the coast. So that's very exciting for us. Next slide. So we are working on packaging up a suite of resiliency guidance for our coastal communities. The package will include some old tools and some new tools that we're working on. Our old tools include the nature-based infrastructure and green infrastructure guidance that we just completed. It includes our disaster recovery and redevelopment planning guide. It will include mitigation and adaptation steps, the suite of ordinances. And we, in the past, we have been running the sea level affecting marsh model for all of our 6 coastal counties, which is SLAM, for those of you that aren't aware. And so now we are also in the process of updating the SLAM model, utilizing the newest LIDAR data set that was delivered last month. It also includes a vegetation correction factor and Georgia salinity numbers. It will also include a Georgia fetch, which was just delivered to us, and really updating that sea level rise data. We will then be taking it and putting it into a hazard vulnerability assessment that's going to be run in October. That will include the fetch, the new SLAM data. It will include an updated shoreline change rates for the ocean facing coast of Georgia, as well as the back barrier portions of our area. It includes an SOVI, Social Vulnerability Index update with the newest census data, and it includes the DFIRM maps and SLOSH as well. And then once we get that HVA run, we'll be meeting individually with each coastal community to talk about the hot spots that have been shown through this assessment. Previously, one of the older data sets that we did as well was running HVA-MH for all of our coastal communities at one time as a region, with 3 different hurricanes with and without sea level rise. And that gives us the impact, the economic impact of what that would be like in the future. And so that will be included into this resiliency guide that we will be reviewing with our coastal communities coming up in the near future. Next slide. As you've heard this morning, a lot about the nature-based infrastructure. We have also been working diligently on living shoreline priorities, living shoreline characterization, thin layer placement. We're pretty new to that, but we continue to look at the opportunities where it will be available, and being able to promote it where it's available. And more recently, high tide berms are something new that we are seeing here. And so being able to include some best management practices with that as well. All right, next slide. Back in 2016, our office kicked off Georgia's first climate conference. It was extremely successful here on the coast. We have since partnered with the Georgia Climate Project, to which they held a kind of a volleying climate conference up in Atlanta. We then brought it back down here last summer. We had one here for the coast. Even in the midst of COVID, it was extremely successful climate conference. We had over 300 attendees, about 138 Georgia projects were presented. So we were really excited, and the next one will be volleying back to Atlanta, and that is going to be in May 15th and 17th of, not Atlanta, I'm sorry, Athens, May 15th and 17th of next year, 2023. And then we hope to volley it back down to the coast afterwards. So those are some really important opportunities for us in the coast to participate in. Okay, next slide. Yeah. So is there a QR code that will pop up by chance? If you click it again? Nope. Okay, sorry. We started a flood literacy project about a year and a half ago. We recognized that there were an issue with terminology that was being used by professionals for flooding. We had the opportunity to bring in a state Sea Grant fellow into our office who worked extremely hard on this project. Her name's Megan Angelina. And we really looked at the inconsistent terms that were being used interchangeably among professionals that work in coastal management and emergency response. Many of you were on our task force. We had over 27 participants, flooding professional participants, who helped us determine what those terms are and how they were being used. And then we kind of came up with a consistent terminology and how to communicate them to the public, to each other, to the media specifically. We also surveyed the general public to find out what was good to use with them, what was extremely confusing with them. We then put it into a story map, and I'm sorry that the QR code is not showing up here. I can share that after the fact, and really put into a story map about where we got our surveys from, what some of the terms were that were confusing, what we as a task force suggested using or not using, and why. And then we defined over 72 different flood terms. This project was extremely successful, and Megan received a national award from the Association of State Floodplain Managers this past spring for that project. I highly recommend you check it out. Next slide. So recently, some of you may be familiar with the former Coastal and Estuarine Land Conservation Program with the administrative funds that have come back around. We are able to get that back on the ground and get that back going. It is out of our office, and we will be helping to identify land conservation areas, competitive funding, and then in the past, when we had this, we did fund a Barrington track and a Murph track. which provided land conservation and a buffer for Fort Stewart's bombing range, and obviously for the Altamaha area usage. So we're really excited to have that back, and we're excited to see where that goes. There is also a resiliency component in the planning portion of this effort. And next slide. Some of you are familiar with this. We have had what we call our community of practice. It's our Georgia Coastal Hazards Community of Practice. It's been ongoing now for about 12 years. We meet quarterly. It is hosted by our office and the Georgia Sea Grant office. We meet quarterly. It's for professionals working on coastal hazards work in coastal Georgia. And we just kind of have a roundtable. We talk about who's doing what, where there are opportunities to partner, to not overlap, and what kind of projects are going on in the area. And it's a really good opportunity to really talk with those who you may not normally hear from or speak to. We do meet in person, especially now. However, there is always an opportunity for call-in because we do have several of our partners who are a part of that who aren't from the coastal area working on coastal issues. So if you're not a part of this project already, please reach out. We'd be happy to add you to our list. And next slide, I think that might be it. Yep, that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions. And I have a couple of links where I can share in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I absolutely love the motion presentation. It just put me right there out on the water. I just felt like I was on a boat, just listening.
Thank you.
I didn't see any questions in the chat so far, but folks, don't be shy. Feel free to jump on in there.
Hey, I had one quick question. For those at maybe the county or city level, do they have an opportunity to join that working group?
Yes, if they are working on coastal hazards.
Gotcha.
And then we have a question from Ashley Worley. She'd like to know, where are the high tide berms being considered or implemented?
There is one already constructed on Sapelo, and there are a couple of other that are being considered on Skidaway.
And then we just had a comment from Tasha that she learned a lot and can't wait to check out the flood literacy story map. And she's excited about hazard vulnerability assessment, the assessment in the guide.
Thanks, Tasha.
Yeah, just wanted to, I guess, highlight one of your, I think, general focuses on the flood literacy and all these ongoing projects from all of our respective agencies here, and how we link those up and kind of tell a common story. And it seems like you're at the front line of that, and the rest of us sort of engaging better with CRD, especially for telling that story in Georgia, would be really helpful. So appreciate all the hard work you all are doing.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Same here. We are slightly ahead of schedule. So if you guys would like to take a 10-minute break, we can come back and, or we can just continue with the next presentation. It's up to you guys. We'll have another break after the next presentation. So let's just go ahead and take a quick bathroom break. So be back in 10 minutes. That'll be 11:23, and then we'll move on with the next presentation.
Quick sound check.
Yep, I can hear you great.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Well, once again, welcome back from the break. I'm Scott Pippin. I'm a member of the public service faculty here at the Carl Vince Institute of Government at the University of Georgia. So this is not the slide deck I thought we were going from, but we'll just see where this goes then. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I was planning to talk more about the specific work we do at the Institute of Government and the variety of ways that we engage with local government specifically, but also state and federal governments as a member of the public service mission here at the University of Georgia. But one of the things that we do is through our partnership with the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems at the College of Engineering, we're talking a lot about how natural and nature-based infrastructure it can be used to enhance community resilience. And when we talk about natural infrastructure, you heard a lot about this from Tricia earlier and from Jess and Jennifer. But we're talking about this like intentional integration of natural living systems with design and built systems. So, you know, this is a bunch of examples of stormwater infrastructure that's been implemented at the site scale, you know, that's meant to address specific runoff challenges from development. And it integrates, you know, plants and living material with things like gravel and pipes and traditional infrastructure elements so that it provides a more robust suite of services, everything from cleaning the water and increasing evapotranspiration so there's less runoff into the stormwater system, but also providing habitat for pollinators and other species, as well as the aesthetic and economic benefits that come from having a more aesthetically pleasing parking lot or more aesthetically pleasing landscape. So it's about developing infrastructures that serve a variety of goals and enhance resilience by thinking through how these investments can tackle a number of challenges. So next slide, please.
Hey, Scott, I think we can transition to your most recent version if you prefer that.
Sure, that would be great.
All right.
But could also go with this.
Sorry. Folks,
Didn't do that one because I didn't think the animations were going to work, but so with a slightly different version.
Yeah, there we are. No, that's not sharing. All right. Is
Yeah,
that the third version? Okay.
Thank you. Sorry for that confusion. Yeah, and see, this one matches the template and everything. So, go ahead and skip to the next slide.
There we go.
So, yeah, so Carl Vince Institute of Government. For those of you not familiar, we are a member of the Public Service and Outreach Mission of the University of Georgia. A lot of you probably heard this before, but at UGA, there are three sort of main pillars in its overall mission. The first being most obvious is the education of students. You know, we have about 40,000 some odd students here on campus these days. And so that is one of the primary things we do. The second is to do cutting edge research, you know, in all of the fields that we engage in, from history to engineering to, you know, nanotechnologies. doing a robust set of research to further all of those academic disciplines. But the third one, and less discussed, is the public service and outreach mission, where we try to bring those resources from the Institute of Government and develop independent resources to support government agencies, or to support the state of Georgia, really, but at the Carl Institute of Government. As a member of the Public Service and Outreach Mission, we support government agencies doing work in Georgia. We've been doing this for about 95 years. I recently learned that over that time, the institute has gone by a variety of names. I guess Carl Vinson didn't serve in Congress, 100 years ago, so it wasn't always called that. And at one point, it was known as the Institute for the Study of Georgia Problems, which is an objectively terrible name, but I think it's actually a fair description of what we do. If you go to the next slide, please. So we have a really wide diversity of faculty and staff that are working on a tremendous array of issues across the state for all levels of government, state, local, and federal. Everything from doing the demographic projections in conjunction with the governor's office to doing workforce development, to the training and education of all newly elected officials, as well as a number of professional associations such as the Georgia Association of Water Planners and the Georgia Association of Zoning Administrators, and a host of others. But if you go to the next slide, please. But I am in the Planning and Environmental Services Unit. Our specific role is to provide technical assistance to government agencies related to environmental and community development issues. We both provide direct support in terms of technical assistance and research support for issues in those agencies or local governments are facing, and we also connect those partners to research that is being done or has been done at the university, identifying opportunities for past research to be applied in a local community, or trying to make those connections between the research faculty and community partners where that research could have an impact and increase resilience in the future. There are three ways that we sort of do that work. One is from direct contracting with partner government agencies and local governments. Secondly, we also often partner with them to do grant writing and generate funding to support that research or support that technical assistance. Or third, we often receive large kind of block grants from different partners to support specific types of engagement with local governments. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities that we're engaged in with that towards the end of this discussion. Next slide, please. In the Planning and Environmental Services Unit, we bring a variety of expertise to talk about, local resilience and community planning. I myself am a lawyer, but also have a master's degree in urban and environmental planning. We have landscape architects, we have other design professionals, and we focus a lot on graphic design these days, and just really trying to think about how graphic design and visualization of some of the practices and ideas that we talk about can help communicate these best practices and help drive better planning and better preparation for climate resilience and other challenges. So next slide, please. And so one of the things that we do a lot of is law and policy research, both at a high level of trying to think about how broad concepts and theoretical ideas of law and policy impact local planning, impact environmental management, talking about how, at the law review and academic journal type level, trying to drive that practice and to drive that like these concepts and do some of that kind of cutting edge, innovative research. But we also do the bread and butter, like how does this actually work on the ground? How is this actually impacting communities? And what are their needs? And how do we develop resources to support that kind of adaptation and resilience planning at the local level? So Jennifer talked a lot about this coastal resilience guide that we worked on with them and with funding from the Coastal Zone Management Program. And we helped develop those model ordinances and sort of the planning paradigm that is embodied in this guide, and then trying to do some training and education with local governments about how to implement these practices and how these things can actually be applied and connected to developing more resilient infrastructure and landscapes in the coast of the Georgia coast. So next slide, please. And we also do sort of direct master planning. You know, how does sort of the larger landscape planning, comp plans, and other type of planning activities affect that kind of resilience and informing the application of those principles in that sort of context. The recent update of the Jekyll Master Plan is a great example of that. We were engaged with Jekyll Island, you know, what was it, 10, 12 years ago when they originally crafted their most recent version of their master plan. They really settled a lot of issues about how to draw the boundaries of their conservation areas. And then we were engaged to help them update it, I guess, last year. But really driving home the idea that protecting those natural resources and protecting the environmental systems that are already in the landscape are an essential part of planning for resilience. That it's not all just how do we build new things and how do we design new features, but how do we recognize the value and the protection provided by things like our existing forests, things like the existing marsh and oyster reefs, and then how do we account for those in planning for future resilience and intentionally design with those things in mind so that we're not undermining our future resilience to build some some other projects in the short term. So next slide, please. And then we also try to connect that to economic development, sustainable economies, ideas of social equity, and how does this actually affect people? In the economic development sphere, one of the things we've been working on is working with Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant on their efforts to promote Georgia aquaculture, oyster aquaculture in Georgia. As some of you are probably aware, a couple of years ago, the General Assembly updated the regulations concerning oyster harvesting in Georgia to allow modern practices for growing single shell, half shell oysters. And then Marine Extension has been deeply involved in promoting that industry and developing a hatchery to provide the resources that growers need to start, as well as doing research to inform the practices of how growers will be able to do this in the Georgia environment. So, well, at the same time, we've been engaging with them to talk about how those practices are likely to actually be implemented in actual communities. How does this affect, the local master planning efforts, zoning, and how can communities be ready to manage potential challenges that come with this industry, but more importantly, be ready to receive it and promote it where it's desired, so that local planning and local regulations don't become a hindrance to what is an important economic development opportunity in coastal Georgia. And how does this connect into resilience? Well, I think it's an important component to think about how economic development reinforces those ideas of natural resource conservation and protecting the environmental services that we've talked so much about. And the great thing about oysters is not only do they provide things like clean water, they depend on the sustainment of the Georgia marsh, of protecting some of those upland areas and managing stormwater more effectively. So by promoting economic development that relies and values those types of environmental services and values that type of infrastructure resilience, I think it creates a base to really socialize those concepts in people's basic planning, people's basic activity, when they have a more direct connection to how this is going to impact people in their community, how it's going to impact the economy, and in the future. So really trying to think about how we involve this idea of resilience in all aspects of planning and in our work with local governments. So next slide, please. And that includes thinking about more traditional planning things that we've done for a long time, including downtown design and downtown planning. For 20 years or so now, our group has been involved in something called the Renaissance Strategic Visioning Partnership. It's a partnership with the Georgia Municipals Association and the Georgia Cities Foundation, and then a host of other communities to do downtown plans in, I don't know, some 50 some odd communities around the state. And it's a process of coming in and working with communities and envisioning how they can breathe new life or revive or accentuate economic development and community development opportunities in their downtowns. But increasingly, we're trying to figure out how to incorporate these resilient infrastructure and these natural resource planning opportunities into that type of planning, where as you're envisioning what a new streetscape should look like, or what a new commercial area should be, how can you simultaneously identify the resilience challenges and vulnerabilities in that area, and involve some of these natural resource or natural infrastructure or resilient infrastructure solutions in that design? That provides multiple benefits. One, it lessens some of the impact of new development and redevelopment potentially on the surrounding environment, and trying to minimize the increase of vulnerability that new development can cause. But also, if you can align some of the economic development opportunities with some of these resilient infrastructure opportunities, it provides opportunities for more effective and efficient spending. Basically, you can leverage more funding resources to do things and to implement projects if you can pull both from your economic development funding mechanisms and some of these infrastructure development mechanisms. So a great example of that is, if you go to the next slide, please. A couple of years ago, we completed one of these visioning plans with the city of Hinesville. And actually, our connection to the city of Hinesville grew out of our participation in that coastal green infrastructure guide. So we were there talking about resilience, and they're like, what we really want to talk about is downtown development. How do we get more businesses? How do we get more foot traffic in our downtown? And really, it's like, you don't have to separate those things. We should be talking about those things together, about how do you revitalize downtown at the same time that you are addressing some of the flooding and water quality challenges that we had identified downstream. So the result of that, after a couple of years of work, was this strategic visioning plan for downtown Hinesville. And part of that was a reimagining of Bradwell Park, which is their sort of central downtown square, right next to the courthouse and city hall. And it was really the social and commercial center of their downtown. And in re-envisioning that, we also thought about how it could serve as a stormwater management infrastructure. So we incorporated things like the pervious pavers and rain gardens, and a lot of protecting a lot of the existing vegetation, like the existing live oaks that were there. And talk about how, like, not only then is this now a revised and frankly a beautiful new park, it is also treating stormwater and reducing some of the downstream flows that were causing flooding in various parts in the county. And so with this, we were able to also support some grant writing efforts and bring in a couple $100,000 of additional funding to support this. And they built this park, as you see in this picture, and it opened a few weeks ago. So I think it's a great example of how, thinking about these things holistically at the kind of early concept planning stage can really lead in a different direction and lead to some real world impacts. And it's a great way to think about how these projects can be implemented, is how they align with existing and a variety of local priorities. Next slide, please. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one thing we're really working on is new ways of communicating these values and communicating these opportunities. I think we've, in the last few years, or maybe it's just my exposure to them, but the potential of graphic design and for layout and for these concepts to be displayed in innovative and creative ways has just exploded. And I've seen a lot firsthand about how effective these images like this can be in communicating what words and what my lectures and harping just failed to do. And so we're really working on things like in that strategic visioning plan for Hinesville, how to demonstrate the value of these things and the effectiveness and a lot of these environmental resilience concepts that have been difficult to explain, but a picture's worth 1,000 words. So how do we help people envision it? Next slide, please. And so that leads me to some of our also more technical work. So as part of that effort to connect our more traditional community engagement, technical assistance work with a more robust connection to resilient infrastructure, thinking more specifically about infrastructure systems. We spent the last couple of years developing a partnership with the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems here at UGA, or IRIS. So in addition to being a faculty member at the Institute of Government, I'm also the Associate Director of Planning Policy at IRIS. So that's meant to specifically merge these capacities at the Institute of Government with this design and engineering capacity of other parts of the university. So next slide, please. And so the mission of IRIS is specifically this idea of how do we integrate natural and conventional infrastructures to build more robust systems to better protect and further our social goals of economic development and public health and safety. Next slide, please. And we bring in, as you saw from the previous picture, I think it's up to 40 some odd faculty members from across campus now, from virtually every college or department, every possibly connected expertise we could think of, or that we come across, where from geologists to lawyers like myself, anthropologists, meteorologists, economists, and of course some engineers here and there, all to think about the various social, political, and technical aspects of doing this. Because I think we've heard a lot of this is not just an engineering challenge. It's not just about can we build these things, but how do we build them? Where do we build them? And how do we get people to build them? And so we're really trying to do that whole cradle to grave sort of concept of developing better resilient infrastructure systems and seeing them implemented actually on the ground. Next slide, please. And part of that is also this partnership we're developing with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineering Nature program. So a lot of our ideas about how to integrate these natural features into traditional infrastructure systems are being driven by what the Army Corps is doing. And at the same time, we're trying to inform and advance how the Army Corps' Engineering Nature program thinks about engineering with nature and answering some of those fundamental social and technical questions that have been identified as barriers to implementing these kinds of projects, as well as directly connecting them with potential partners who are interested in developing future pilot projects and trying to further that actual implementation of real world projects. So next slide, please. So back to these slides again. So talked about these earlier. When we talk about natural infrastructure, we're talking about both the small scale, site level things. We can go on to the next slide. But also much larger scale landscape type features, where we're talking about understanding how entire coastal wetland systems function and how they can be enhanced or protected, and understanding the value that they're providing for things like storm protection and water quality, and how does that connect to the design of built systems that account for that and protect those values, so you're not building things like a seawall that is actually going to destroy the seaward marsh and lessen and lose the coastal protection value that those systems provide, and thus requiring a more robust and extensive built system. This applies to things like barrier islands and beaches and dunes and oyster reefs, all of which not only provide the same sorts of infrastructure systems for reducing storm surge or protecting from tidal flooding, but also are economic and aesthetic and biological resources in their own right. That they provide important habitat for other species. They help sustain the natural sediment sharing system that perpetuate the wetlands and other marsh areas and other components of the coastal system. But so understanding that these infrastructure systems that we're talking about are not discrete features, but are really parts of dynamic, hybrid, natural built environments. And so then how do we plan and design them as such? So, next slide, please. And to put it in the parlance of the engineering with nature program, we're not talking about engineering against nature, which is the traditional idea that we build things to try to buffer ourselves or protect ourselves from the impacts of nature. Or it's not engineering for nature, which is kind of the ecological restoration paradigm. How do we build things that promote specific biological or environmental values. How do we work with it? How do we do those things at the same time? How do we thoughtfully and intentionally and strategically integrate our built environment with the natural environment so that you can further both of those goals of protecting habitat, protecting and creating biological resources, while also buffering ourselves and lessening our community vulnerabilities to some of the extremes of the natural environment. And again, it's not just thinking about these things as discrete features, but understanding how they function in a system and that they are themselves systems of systems, and trying to approach in a much more dynamic format. So it's a really paradigm shifting idea of what we mean by infrastructure to enhance this kind of resilience. So, next slide, please. And so out of that partnership with IRIS and Engineering with Nature, we've created this partnership of the Network for Engineering with Nature. I know I'm talking about a lot of different acronyms and groups here, but they're really just representing the diversity of partners that we're trying to, in ways we're trying to engage and approach these issues. So NOON is specifically a partnership between UGA and the Engineering Research Development Center, EWN, at the Army Corps, but it's also bringing in academic and public and private sector partners from around the country interested in tackling these issues in a collaborative and mutually supporting way. And the four main focuses of this research is addressing the methods and standards that are needed to sort of standardize this kind of work in engineering practice, assessing the benefits and costs to facilitate planning, both within the Army Corps' planning process, but also outside of that for local governments and other state agencies in their infrastructure planning, so they can really assess more accurately and effectively assess these projects in parallel to traditional infrastructure. You know, we have a couple hundred years of experience in designing and evaluating the effectiveness of concrete and steel structures, but I think some additional thought is needed to really understand the effectiveness of these natural systems and put them on par with those in our design and development processes. And related to that then is understanding how they're going to perform over time. You know, really investing in the performance monitoring of these systems so that we can better understand how that affects the benefits and costs. And then there's the integration of people and policy. You know, understanding how there are barriers in our procedures and in our laws and policies that sort of make it sometimes more challenging to do these innovative and new infrastructure development systems, and then identifying those and trying to work on solutions to address those, but also trying to align them with the actual social needs and preferences and desires of the affected communities. You know, how do we identify the goals of a specific community that can be furthered, and which environmental systems and which natural systems are best suited to address the particular challenges of a given place or a given community. So addressing across those four pillars, we're hoping to, again, have that complete picture of how to design and plan for natural infrastructure. So next slide, please. And so that Network for Engineering Nature, NOON, is the research branch of this partnership with EWN. At the same time, we are developing something we're calling the Military Community Engagement Initiative. And that is this effort to really take that research and take EWN to communities and take it out of the ground and try to apply those things in real community planning context and develop pilot projects and connect partners with funding to build these things. We are specifically targeting communities that support military communities, basically because of the nature of the funding that we're receiving. But in that same time, I don't want to give a message that that's the only thing we're doing, because I think that it's we're also thinking about this from a regional and landscape perspective. So the resilience and needs of those communities are also connected to a broader landscape resilience idea. So the idea is to really think broadly about how resilience across, say, the coastal environment affects the resilience of each community and military installation in it. And so really trying to take a really broad approach to thinking about that. So next slide, please. Oh, next slide. So the places we're currently engaged, we're piloting this for the last year or so at Fort Benning, and sort of develop a model for how we connect and engage with both the military installation and the surrounding community. But during that time, we've also begun engagement with folks from South Carolina at MCS Beaufort, Fort Stewart, Kings Bay down in Camden County, as well as Mayport and Jacksonville. Again, thinking about how the connections between the installation's resilience and the community's resilience provides opportunities for greater investment, and how can these natural infrastructure practices be used to further both of their goals, as well as further the other social and community goals from the community, whether that's developing trails or protecting marsh or protecting working forests. These are all goals that when need to be thought about comprehensively in the design and implementation of these practices. So, and again, while we have points on a map of places that we're engaged, we're really trying to think about these all as an integrated landscape. How does the design and resilience of one piece of this affect the others? And so how do we think about the engagement of the whole with each of the pieces? I feel like I'm just talking in circles now. So next slide, please. And so what we're doing is we, at Fort Benning, and it's where we're beginning to do with these other installations, we met with installation staff and leadership and developed kind of a work plan of ways that we can engage and make real practical contributions to their efforts in resilience planning, and how to foster the use of some of these natural infrastructure techniques to promote it. Things like how can we connect it to their need to use this Army climate assessment tool? How can we help them address some stormwater challenges? They have a 100-year-old stormwater system that is mostly clay crumbling pipes. So how can we identify opportunities for natural infrastructure interventions to reduce that? And as we work on this work plan, hopefully we'll develop a sort of a comprehensive vision of a larger and larger scale natural infrastructure components that can both bolster the installation resilience and the larger community resilience. And then next slide. And at the same time, we are working with the surrounding counties, all of the communities adjacent to Fort Benning, to talk about how the environmental compliance and resilience issues that Fort Benning is engaged in impact them. There's a lot of concern from these communities in particular that land restoration was an economic drain, that it was depleting their tax base and reducing their ability to fund local services. So one of the things we're doing is looking at how what are the economic development opportunities associated with some of that conservation and restoration, and how can they and how can DoD and other partners provide resources to offset the burden that's being placed on them by doing this resilience planning in a way that is also more socially and economically resilient for those communities? How does it contribute to the economic prosperity as well as to the environmental sustainability and the sustainability of the military mission? Because really, again, it's about the idea that resilience isn't just about physical security, but it's about the social and economic prosperity of an area as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's all I've got. We've got a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has any, but I appreciate your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. Any questions from the group? I didn't see any in the chat thus far. But we will give it another minute if you want to come off mute or enter that into the chat box.
I just wanted to highlight that collaborative effort with Engineering with Nature and some of the ongoing studies we're doing with USACE and UGA and a whole bunch of other stakeholders. For those that may not know, one is the Jekyll Island sand motor that we're right in the process of collecting data and modeling. So that's kind of in its infancy, but we're just getting started. And another is associated with the AIWW, and we're working to try and come up with a tool to help site selection for beneficial use. So I think there's two awesome efforts just coming out of there and should really benefit the state of Georgia.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting those, Jared. Yeah, I did not get a chance to mention those, but those are two particularly exciting things that we're engaged in, and very excited to see where they go. That could be huge.
Yeah, what I've gathered thus far throughout this workshop is once we've used some of the tools that we went over yesterday and a little bit today, you've identified a problem, addressed it, and now you would lean into this partnership and these initiatives to begin that planning process and begin, strategically coming up with a plan to address those issues.
I think that's a great summation. And also, if there's we can be of some assistance in even trying to use some of the tools that have been discussed earlier. And I think one of our roles is to help provide that capacity, particularly the local governments who may not have the wherewithal or that time, frankly, to do some of that. If there's an interest in applying a particular tool or in developing particular data, please reach out. We can figure out how to be of assistance in doing that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Scott. So without any further questions, it is now time for lunch. And so that will be an hour. Be back by 1 o'clock, and we will go through 2 other items on the agenda. All right, it is 1 o'clock. We can give just a minute or so to make sure we all get settled back in from after lunch. Coming up next, as you'll see on the screen, we are going to have Jack Krolikowski go over some of the hazard mitigation assistance grants that may be available to you. Also, what's not on the agenda is a demonstration. If you were here for the first session yesterday, Blair Holloway with the National Weather Service had wanted to do a demo, but the site was malfunctioning at the time. So after this presentation, he's going to come on and give us that demo. Thankfully, it's working today. So yeah, we'll give it another minute and then we will get started with Jack. All right, I'll assume we have everybody that we need to have. So, Jack, whenever you're ready, you can take the floor.
All right, thanks, Pamela. Is everyone able to hear me? Could I get a thumbs up or two?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, and thanks as always to Pamela. I know Krolikowski's a tough one, and I got to say you're one of the best in the business in coming up with a pronunciation of Krolikowski. So that's always appreciated. But I'm here presenting on behalf of the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency and discussing the hazard mitigation assistance grants. Next slide, please. So here, like any state, federal, even local government, right, we've got our missions and vision. So essentially, long story short of the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency is the protection of life and property, and specifically our department, the Hazard Mitigation Department. You know, we're talking about sustained actions to reduce long-term risk to life and property from hazard events, specifically natural hazards. Next slide, please. So how this all starts, if we're going to be talking about this sort of long-term risk reduction, we start that with planning efforts. This is kind of, as you can see in that Venn diagram there, sort of risk as this intersection of hazard and exposure and vulnerability, not unlike any of the other tools we've seen over the last kind of day and a half. We work with all the local governments in the state. There are 159 counties, of course, and so there are 159 multi-jurisdictional county hazard mitigation plans. Those are sort of address a range of natural perils, though, you know, as most of our focus has been in the coastal environment, flooding in every county is one of those always kind of high focus, high impact perils. And so, as I said, we have planning activities that we work to fund via grants through our department. We have planning specialists spread throughout the state. And if you're interested in seeing anything about your given community or either where you live, where you work, et cetera, this sort of the status of the hazard mitigation plan, I just put a link in the chat. You know, for the sake of transparency, we're never at 159 out of 159 county plans totally updated, but we do our best to try to facilitate that while still respecting kind of the local government's sort of sovereignty in terms of coming up with a plan that works for them. So we facilitate that grant funding, but really leave the grant writing primarily to sort of the local governments. And so though we do refer to them as a county level plan, you may have noticed earlier, I said multi-jurisdictional. So when we're talking about the Jeff Davis plan, we're talking about both sort of the unincorporated county and the municipalities therein. Next slide, please. One of the pieces that we're excited about, and this is why I sort of laid this out, is where we headed. This is in terms of future conditions, but this is increasingly going to be a focus both of our local hazard mitigation plans. I already talked about that. There's 159 of them. Those turn over on a 5-year cycle, so roughly 30 or so a year. On that same 5-year cycle, we also have our state hazard mitigation plan. And a lot of the folks on the line have been involved in that over the years, but that last plan was approved in 2019. So that would give us a run of 5 years through March of 2024. So we're really kind of in the beginning stages of starting our update to that state plan. It's our intention to get that over to FEMA for final approval in the fall of 2023. So if you're a state partner in particular and have not been a part of any of that communication on the update to the state plan, please feel free to send me an email, and I would love to get you and your organization involved. Just put my email address there in the chat as well. But one of the things we're really excited about is to better address future conditions and equity in our planning efforts moving forward, both those local plans and the state plan. There's new review guidance from FEMA, and they tend to refer to future conditions. And so that's kind of what we're getting at with this Venn diagram, in the sense that those future conditions are certainly climate change is probably the most relevant sort of future condition, but our future risk profile also, of course, would be subject to development patterns and demographics, not unlike a lot of those strategies that Scott was mentioning in the previous presentation. Next slide, please. So once we take those planning activities together, we're understanding our vulnerabilities, where we have risk, where we're exposed. Well, the next thing, along with all of these thoughts that Jennifer laid out and Scott laid out, was how can we pay for them? And so that's kind of the other half of our shop, is pursuing the grants for funding with other state agencies or with local governments as the applicants to sort of receive those funds and realize a project. This is one of our favorite slides to show. This is essentially showing benefit cost ratios as different perils are addressed. And you can see sort of federal grants with an overall benefit cost ratio of 6 to 1, maybe even 7 to 1 on that riverine flood. Hurricane surge, obviously a little bit different here, but I think this is one of those reports that really helps us get buy-in from elected officials, particularly at the state level, and our leadership. Once the slides are made available, I believe that link, if kept as a PDF, should be live. If not, again, please feel free to email me and I can get this National Institute of Building Sciences report and link available to you. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the biggest pieces on these grants is the necessity, and this is due to the fact that these are federal funds, of demonstrating cost effectiveness, right? Or the sort of the return on investment. So I'm going to sort of talk about this in two different ways. So the benefits of the project are those avoided losses or avoided service delivery interruption. So for those of you who have been around the state or federal government for a long time, you know that these FEMA emergency management sort of centric grants have existed for a long time. Over time, I think the perspective of what is to be addressed, thank you, Pamela, for that link, to be addressed by these funds has really broadened. You can see this community lifelines framework across the bottom. And so certainly there's some of those kind of traditional emergency management type things we might think about in terms of safety and security, hazardous materials. Everybody knows GEMA is able to fund generators and warning sirens and weather radios, things like that. But when you look across those lifelines, food, water, and shelter, health and medical, communication, transportation, this is really a pretty broad portfolio, if you will, of eligible activities for relevant service delivery issues from a local government perspective, right? So just that's something that we would ask, I think, of all of you as partners, is to help us amplify that message in terms of saying, yes, it is the Georgia Emergency Management Agency, but we're really able to fund activities across a breadth of sort of issues that local governments might have. The second bullet point here is really a way of sort of framing this investment as what kind of access to federal dollars is the local government getting. And so I have a follow-up slide that talks about the specific grant programs and some sort of nuts and bolts of those. But really what's important to recognize is that if a local government is putting a dollar sort of on the table in terms of proposed investment, any of those grants are going to bring back at least $2 1/3 federal on top of that, right? And then you can see in the second bullet under the hazard mitigation grant program, that's currently set up as a 90% federally funded program. And so that $1 being pledged, if you will, by a local government or an eligible state agency or a qualifying nonprofit, their $1 of investment in mitigation will yield sort of $9 in federal funds if approved, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that review process. Next slide, please. So this is a busy slide, and the reason it is such is because this communicates essentially the nuts and bolts of those 3 grants that we administer in a fairly concise way, right? So this is the one that if you want to screenshot and sort of this is the pocket guide to what we do, right? So you can see some considerations there in the left-hand column and then the 3 different grant programs across the right. So I'm just going to walk through these line by line. But please feel free to stop me in my tracks with a question in the chat, or we can, of course, handle it sort of as a question and answer on the back end, right? But let me start with the carrot that you can see there, kind of flagging all 3 grant programs down there at the bottom. So all local government applicants, which we really refer to as sub-applicants, from a grants management perspective, the state GMA in this case is the applicant, and the sub-applicant would either be another state agency, a qualifying nonprofit that's only under the hazard mitigation grant program, as you can see there in the 4th row. But any sub-applicants or any local government must participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So definitely want to give a shout out to Hayden Blaze, who's been on the line for the better portion, certainly of the last couple of days, and his team's work over at the Department of Natural Resources for keeping those communities eligible within the National Flood Insurance Program and enrolling those communities that do not yet participate. So that's that first carrot. The availability of the funding. So you can see here that building resilient infrastructure in communities and flood mitigation assistance, those are essentially an annual appropriation that makes the funds available. The hazard mitigation grant program there in the middle, this comes via the Stafford Act. So when you hear something like Murray County had a presidentially declared disaster, that's triggering these grant funds to be available. The most recent presidential declaration we've had in the state, it's actually currently the only declaration that we have open for this funding, is the COVID-19 pandemic. So what's important to recognize there in the second line, as I'm focusing on that COVID-19 pandemic line, is that though the presidential declaration that led to the availability of funds was a pandemic, the proposed project need not have a sort of unique public health nexus. So for all intents and purposes, this is no different than when this program was triggered for Hurricane Michael or Hurricane Irma or Tropical Storm Alberto, for that matter, right? 2009 flooding in Atlanta. All of those events essentially triggered funding the same way that this has. You can see the current funding under the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. Those numbers have actually moved up since I printed this. You can find this information for the specific top line numbers for those funding sources at the link that I just provided, which is the notices of funding opportunity for fiscal year 2022. Those numbers that I had listed were fiscal year 21, but it's really not that relevant. The top line numbers, what's probably more relevant for any given local government is if you go down and see that maximum award line, 50 million, 30 million. So that's what an individual award from a given sub-applicant could be awarded. Needless to say, a given local government wouldn't be eligible for $1 billion under that Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community. So as you can see, the next line is that competition. So you can see flood mitigation assistance and that Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. That competition is nationwide. It's a program that has gone through 2 different fiscal years. And so with that, we've seen growth of the dollars available and growth, quite frankly, the success of our program and accessing that funds. Some of you may know that the city of Savannah was deemed, this is quote, selected for further review, which is a pretty good indication that ultimately that funding will be obligated for their Springfield Canal project. That's about a $30 million federal share project that was announced last month. And that was the sort of the biggest mitigation grant that our department has won in the history of the program, which is sort of going on 3 decades. Really relevant in the middle there where it says statewide competition for the hazard mitigation grant program. This is essentially a first come, first serve situation. So it is competitive in the sense that projects must be eligible. They must demonstrate cost effectiveness, must be able to pass through approval under NEPA, all these pieces, but generally speaking, it's going to be a sort of a first come, first serve amongst local governments in Georgia. Hopefully many of you received an email either from one of our team members or even myself in the last couple of days talking about upcoming applicant briefings. That's to cover all 3 programs. So if you did not receive that email in the last couple of days, please let me know. Please send me an email. We have 10 in-person presentations planned in September. 2 sort of down in the Southeast Georgia area. 1 will be in Bullock County. 1 is in Pierce County. And then we'll also have 2 virtual options. But that's really one of our efforts to really broaden the applicant field, really try to focus on that equity piece in reaching out to underserved communities. It's never going to be perfect. We're having 10. We could have 100. We could have 700, right? So it's never going to be good enough, but we think that this is at least a step in the right direction. Eligible sub-applicants, this is very important. You can see state and local governments for flood mitigation assistance in building resilient infrastructure and communities will add qualifying private nonprofits for that hazard mitigation grant program. That said, there still could certainly be a role for private nonprofits in those other 2 grant programs. They just wouldn't be the eligible sub-applicant themselves. So that would be sort of them linking up with a local government. So that's definitely something that we can work through, and I'll take the advantage of the moment to sort of highlight this in general. Again, I'm partway through this table, very detailed, not particularly interesting to the layperson, right? So really what we would encourage folks who are engaging with local governments themselves, other state agencies who may be eligible sub-applicants, please just reach out. You know, our contact information will be here a couple times, and as well as mine in the chat, but please feel free to reach out. Please don't feel like if you aren't sure that you're going to sort of self-regulate and say, no, I don't want to, you know, I think this, you know, here's what we're going to do. You can see the numbers that are available. You can see the cost shares. You can see the competitive nature. You can see eligible entities. You can see eligible activities. We just want to kind of work with you to make an informed decision that we think is going to be most likely to get money to you quickest. That's a number that's quickest sort of in the eye of the beholder. We'll cover that. And at the lowest cost to you, you can see some of these cost shares, right? So there's no perfect answer, but that's really what we would say is please come forward at any time. We happen to have the funding open under all 3 programs right now. But even if that weren't the case, folks can please move forward with a pre-application kind of as the first step. That's our screening tool. I'm about to put a link for those pre-applications in the chat. So one thing I will say is that those pre-applications may not be totally comprehensive of anything you have in mind. If you're not sure which direction to go, please feel free to reach out even prior to filling out a pre-application. That's no problem at all. Otherwise, sometimes we'll point folks in the direction of the pre-application that probably makes the most sense given their proposed project, even if it's not kind of a perfect fit. And that just comes down to the fact that we've got those pre-applications set up for what has kind of traditionally been the most popular project types. Okay. Maximum award, we sort of talked about. Grant deadline, This actually got simplified a little bit, again, as I put in the chat a couple of links ago with that notice of funding opportunity. You can see it reading FY 2022 NOFO, but that's the notice of funding opportunity. Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community Flood Mitigation Assistance, due the last week of January. That COVID-19 hazard mitigation grant program there in the middle, where I have per disaster declaration date, it's actually due the first week of February. And so for all intents and purposes, all three of these grants are running on the same timeline. We use the same pre-applications. They're sort of funding source agnostic. And so everybody's essentially on the same timeline. And again, please make sure to join us for those applicant briefings coming up. And that's where we'll lay out sort of the milestones, the sub deadlines leading up to that grant deadline, because we need some time in-house to work with those to ensure that everything's polished and we're really putting those sub applications sort of as the best quality that we can. My least favorite part of the presentation is these last two lines. So application review, these take quite a while, right? And we certainly know the pressure that this puts on local governments, other state agencies in terms of trying to project their budgets when these are going outside of out of a given fiscal year. Trust me, I would have many fewer gray hairs if this weren't the case. I try to be as mellow as possible with our federal partners in terms of being productive in the conversations and keeping these things moving. But I would rather be totally transparent and give a number that is quite frankly embarrassing for me than to mislead any other state agency or local government partner. So again, from the informed decision perspective, that's why these dates are here. Depending on the project type, there are some that we can move pretty quickly, particularly under that hazard mitigation grant program. But needless to say, the more complicated the scope, right? When we start moving into some of those bigger infrastructure size or the nature-based solutions where it's maybe a reviewer's first time looking at one of those approaches, maybe NEPA is a little bit different than what they might be used to, or the cost benefit analysis, that's where these things can drag out a little bit. But again, I'm happy to discuss with any given sub-applicant or anyone who has anything under review for that matter. Last line, administration, just want to highlight here with the asterisk there about reimbursement. So no physical work can start prior to the award. Similarly to the line above it, that puts pressure on local governments, right? They say, hey, can't we just start and we'll wait on the reimbursement, and even if it doesn't come, the answer is no. That would make the essentially the award ineligible per the sort of the grant law, if you will. So unfortunately, that flexibility is not there, and so that's just something that, particularly on these construction projects, or something that's including ground disturbance, whether that's a nature-based solution or a green gray or all the way gray, those are not going to be able to start until the announcement. Sort of the award is formally obligated. Next slide, please. Here's our contact information. Again, my name is Jack Krolikowski, Deputy Manager of the department. As I referenced earlier in our slides, we have two sections. The hazard mitigation planning section led by Alan Sloan, who a lot of folks on the line probably know. Alicia Shaning going on her third year with the agency, and she's the one who heads up those projects. So that's my last slide. I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
Yes, thank you, Jack. I'm definitely that 1 year to 18 months to 18 to possibly 2 years definitely stood out. So it's very important to get involved early, ask all the questions, and get that application in as soon as possible so that review can begin. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but we have time for questions. If you guys want to come off of mute, feel free.
And I just wanted to highlight that I think, Jack at GMA and they're and Jennifer at CRD, they're kind of our eyes and ears on the ground when interacting with a lot of the Georgia communities. So by the time we hear of something going on in Georgia at USACE, and we're engaging, you know, Jennifer and Jack are almost always on top of what's going on, whether it just be informal discussions on an issue with flooding or something of that nature. So I just want to highlight that relationship and how we all work together to have those discussions with stakeholders. And it's like first line of defense. I know the mitigation grants are massive, and it's something we work towards, assisting Jack and the communities with some of our programs. But yeah, those initial discussions and how much we learn through those two resources are just huge.
Yeah, definitely, Jared. Thank you. Any last final thoughts? Otherwise, we will shift to our live demonstration with Blair Holloway with the National Weather Service. Let me stop sharing my screen. Blair, you on the line?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Perfect. All right. Let me get here. All right. Can you see the web page here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, again, so my name's Blair Holloway. I'm with the National Weather Service in Charleston, and I presented, was the first presenter yesterday, and unfortunately, this web page that I talked about in my presentation slides was not working at the time, but it is now. So just want to give a quick run through, and if you'll recall, what I was talking about during the presentation were these experimental potential coastal flood extent maps. And in case you need it, let me just type it back in up here. All right, so the web address is weather.gov/ERH/coastal flood. And that'll bring you to this page here. So this is a page created by the Eastern Region headquarters of the National Weather Service. And we are the southernmost office within the Eastern Region. And so they created this web page for coastal flooding purposes. And what I'm going to show you are these coastal flood extent maps. And the first thing I'll point you to, in case you want, it has some nice resources here. You can see the link up here. If you can see my cursor at the top here, it says recorded training. This takes you to a YouTube video that will kind of guide you through using the page, not only the extent maps, but all the other things that are available here. But I'm going to focus mainly on down here, the potential coastal flood extent maps. So first, let me come in and I'm going to zoom us in to the Georgia state level. Okay, and so you can see all of our toggles that we're going to use are down here at the bottom, the potential coastal flood extent maps. If you click on this link here that says how to use this information, it'll take you to another YouTube recording that will kind of step you through the details of what these coastal flood extent maps are. A couple other links that might be of use. There's also a document, this product description document, that explains a lot of what we're going to show here in just a second as well. And then if you are, kind of GIS savvy and want to pull these extent maps into, like a story map or, any type of ArcGIS project that you have, there's a link to the REST services here where you can directly get the links to this particular, these data sets. You can control the opacity, so I'm going to turn that down here a little bit. And the main part are these toggles, and you'll see minor, moderate, major, And then there's three others. There's major plus 1 foot extent, major plus 2, and then major plus 3 feet. And recall that the National Weather Service for these tide gauge locations, and I'll just bring up the Fort Pulaski hydrograph here. We set these coastal flood or these flooding thresholds, and we do that with minor, moderate, and major. So an example here, using Fort Pulaski, minor is 9.5 feet, mean low water, moderate is 10 feet, and major is 10.5. All right, so we'll come down here. We're going to turn on the minor extent, and you'll get this kind of disclaimer that pops up, kind of describing, what this is and what it isn't. And just a reminder, it's basically we're looking at wet versus dry extent. It's not providing any type of depth information. And if we are in the midst of a tropical system, this information isn't necessarily going to be very useful because of the influence of storm surge, and you should refer to any storm surge information from the National Hurricane Center. All right, so I'll turn that off, and I'm going to zoom in here. You can zoom all the way in. You get nice detail. I'm going to kind of zoom into the Tybee Island area here near Fort Pulaski. And so when you toggle on the minor extent, it's basically showing you, the areas that are expected to be wet with minor coastal flooding. And then, kind of give you an example, you can toggle on the moderate. We'll turn off the minor. And that gives you an idea of what the moderate extent looks like, and so forth, all the way up to major. And so it's really useful. You can kind of get, all the way down to the street level and kind of start to see the differences between these three different flooding thresholds. And so, another added benefit is having the major plus 1 foot, major plus 2, and major plus 3. So to give a kind of an example, so at Fort Pulaski, the major flood stage is 10.5 feet. So if we do a major plus 2 foot, or excuse me, let's do major plus 3. So that would be about, that should be, I'm sorry, actually, let's do the plus 2. That would be 12.5 feet based on the gauge height. And just kind of as a reference, let's see. Okay, that's coming on here, it looks like. Yeah. So this major plus 2 foot, that's 12.5 feet as a comparison for the gauge. And basically, this is right in line with the tide height that we saw, like with Hurricane Matthew and with Tropical Storm Irma. So it's kind of a good way to give you a good sense of what the water extent would be at that particular tide height, for something really significant. What would the extent of the saltwater flooding be? What areas would, excuse me, what areas would be wet? What areas would be dry? And we talked a little bit about, not only during my presentation, some of the other ones about Highway 80, which you can kind of make out here, and you can see that some of at these higher levels, we'll toggle off the plus 2, you can see the influence of the water on portions of the roadway, especially as we get kind of further in closer to Savannah, where that's actually underwater at the major flood extent. So that's really all that I wanted to display. Again, these extent levels, these maps are available all the way down for the entire Georgia coast. It stops at the Florida state line, since there are no Eastern Region National Weather Service offices that cover any parts of Florida. So that's available for the entire Georgia coast. I'll wrap it up there. If you have any questions, you can ask it now, or just feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to help.
Yeah, thank you, Blair, for bringing that back around full circle for us, because a lot of these workshops we tend to, get sort of immersed in the content that was just given, but it was nice to get our starting point back at the end, just to sum it all up, because ultimately you're using this tool to assess your hazards, assess the risk, some of the other risk assessment tools that we saw yesterday. Then you would communicate those to decision makers and to the public, and then use strategies along with partners, you know, like our UGA partners and with GEMA to find ways to address those issues and finding possibly nature-based solutions to apply. So I really appreciate you guys. I appreciate all of our attendees and all of our presenters, and I hope you guys got as much out of it as I did. I certainly learned a lot. But that brings our workshop to a close. If there were any additional questions, feel free to come off of mute or put it in the chat box. You can reach out to me directly or any of our presenters. Please get all of the links that are in the chat box before the meeting closes out, because you don't want to miss those resources. But I will also send the presentation out to each of you, and then have it uploaded online for reference at a later date. And if there aren't any other questions, then you guys, do we have a hand raised? Nope. Okay. All right. That was a high five. All right. Yeah. Let us know if you have any feedback from the workshop, any ways to improve, any things that you found most helpful. I would love to hear it. But yeah, that's all we have for you. So you guys enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. And once we have the link ready with